Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back into the hidden world of the Ottoman Harem, a place so secretive that very few ever truly saw it, yet it shaped the course of empires and the fate of sultans. Inside its walls, concubines lived lives of silence, routine and waiting, while outside, the empire rose and fell around them. So before you settle in, take a moment to dim the lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background. And if you enjoy these slow journeys through history, don't forget to subscribe and share where you're listening from in the comments. It's always calming to see how many of us are traveling together through these forgotten corners of the past. Now, let's ease into tonight's story. Imagine the long halls of Topkapı Palace, the muffled footsteps on polished stone, the heavy doors that closed off the harem from the outside world. Tonight, we'll step through those doors and begin with the first moment of arrival, when a young concubine entered the imperial palace. Not knowing what the rest of her life would hold, the life of an Ottoman concubine always began with a journey, though not one of her choosing. The story starts long before her feet crossed the polished stones of Topkapı Palace, in distant villages, marketplaces, or along the uncertain routes of war and tribute. The harem did not simply appear as a gathering of women. It was constructed piece by piece from the quiet removals of daughters from their homes, of captives taken during border conflicts, of girls traded through slave markets that stretched from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Many came from the Caucasus, Circassian, Georgian, or Abkhazian in origin, their features considered desirable in the eyes of the empire, though others were drawn in from the Balkans, from Eastern Europe, or from lands as far as the steppes. Some entered through tribute systems, where regional rulers would send young women as a symbol of loyalty to the sultan. Others were purchased outright by palace officials who scoured markets for the most promising, whether in beauty, youth, or aptitude. Their names were stripped away at the threshold, replaced with new ones chosen in Turkish or Arabic, binding them to this new life and erasing traces of the old. The journey to the palace was often the first encounter with silence as power. The caravan, or ship that carried them, moved without explanation. The girls rarely knew exactly where they were being taken until the vast city of Istanbul revealed itself on the horizon, its skyline jagged with minarets, domes and stone walls. For many it was the largest city they had ever seen, a swelling mixture of merchants, soldiers and pilgrims threading through its narrow streets. Yet even this brief glimpse of life outside the palace would be fleeting. The procession of newcomers passed through the gates, the clamor of the city dying away as they moved deeper inside, where their existence would be confined. Topkapı Palace itself was not a single building, but a vast complex of courtyards, pavilions, gardens and chambers, overlooking the Bosporus. It sat on the Sarajevo Point, surrounded on three sides by water, enclosed by walls that both protected and confined. Entry began at the Imperial Gate, Baba Humayun, where the outside world ended. Beyond lay a sequence of increasingly private spaces, the first courtyard with its treasury and kitchens, the second with the divan chambers of state, the third with the sultan's private quarters, and finally the most hidden, the harem. A girl entering for the first time would feel as though each gate closed another door to freedom, drawing her deeper into a life where every step was regulated, every glance monitored, and every breath taken under the authority of others. For the young concubine, the physical arrival was marked by ceremony but not celebration. She was inspected, recorded, and placed among the ranks of novices, the asimis. The palace officials, often the chief eunuch or senior attendants, evaluated her condition, her manners, and her potential. To her it was disorienting. To them it was routine. Behind the walls of the harem lived hundreds of women, all governed by strict hierarchies, and the arrival of another was a small ripple in the still water of palace life. Yet to the girl herself, everything was overwhelming. The harem was not the noisy market or the open countryside she may have once known. It was an enclosed labyrinth, a world of doors and corridors, soft carpets and high domed ceilings, the faint smell of incense and the constant presence of silence broken only by whispers or the distant call to prayer. Light entered through latticed windows, patterned screens that allowed those inside to look out without being seen. From the first day the message was clear. She was here to be hidden, to be reshaped, to live a life of waiting within walls. Arrival also meant a stripping away of identity. She would be bathed, her old clothes removed, replaced with simple garments that marked her as an assemi. Her hair might be cut or styled to suit palace standards. She would be taught to walk slowly, to lower her eyes, to move with discipline. Every gesture was observed, every error corrected. Those who trained her were not harsh in tone, but relentless in control. There was no room for rebellion. To live in the harem was to surrender to its rules. Still, there was an undeniable grandeur in the palace itself. From certain balconies, one could glimpse the waters of the Golden Horn, where ships moved endlessly, carrying goods and stories from lands she would never see. The gardens were filled with fountains, roses and cypress trees that stood motionless under the sky. The architecture itself was meant to impress upon the newcomer that she had entered not only the Sultan's residence, but the center of an empire stretching across 3 continents. The walls that confined her were also the walls that housed the most powerful court in the Muslim world. It was not unusual for a concubine's first nights to be filled with unease, even quiet grief. Some whispered prayers in the dark, recalling families they would never see again. Others folded themselves into silence, staring at the patterned ceilings until sleep overcame them. The palace was immense, but within the harem, the space felt narrowing, a chamber within a chamber. Yet for all the sorrow of arrival, there was also a strange possibility. The harem was not only a prison but a stage, where a few would rise through ranks, gain influence, and even shape the empire itself. For every young girl who entered, there remained a faint chance, however remote, that her fate might not be obscurity, but power. Thus the arrival at Topkapı Palace was not just a physical moment, but the threshold of an entirely new existence. What lay ahead was uncertainty, discipline, and waiting. Years of preparation before any recognition, years of obedience before even the faintest possibility of being noticed. The gates had closed, and the life of the concubine within the Ottoman court had begun. Crossing the first gates of Topkapı Palace was less a moment of movement than an initiation into an entirely different rhythm of existence. For the young concubine, who had only just arrived and been taken into the custody of palace officials, it was a crossing into silence, into discipline, into a world structured by walls and thresholds. The gates themselves were massive, heavy with iron, adorned with inscriptions in Arabic script that reminded all who passed beneath them that they were entering not an ordinary dwelling, but the seat of imperial power. To the outside world, Topkapı was the heart of the Ottoman state. To those who stepped inside, it was a layered labyrinth, designed to strip away the noise of the city and replace it with a life bounded by ritual and control. The imperial gate, Baba Humayun, opened onto the first courtyard. For a visitor, it was still a public space, filled with servants, gardeners, guards, and even petitioners who might come to lay their requests before the state. But for the concubine, this first court was little more than a passing threshold. She would not linger there, she would not mingle with the bustle. She was guided along with the other newcomers, escorted by eunuchs whose presence was both protective and commanding. Their tall figures, dressed in flowing garments and turbans, spoke of authority even without words. Their very silence made them imposing, and the concubines understood immediately that their lives from this point onward would unfold under these watchful eyes. The first courtyard was broad, open, filled with greenery and lined by service buildings, bakeries, stables, kitchens. For the girl who had perhaps never seen such vast structures devoted entirely to the service of one household, the sight was overwhelming. The palace did not house just a family. It housed an entire world within its walls, with hundreds of servants, cooks, guards, scribes, and attendants, working to keep the machinery of empire in motion. She would notice the clang of metal from the kitchens, the smell of bread rising from ovens large enough to feed thousands. And yet, even amid this activity, there was an air of control, of restraint. Voices were hushed, footsteps measured, as though even in this outer space, all sound bent itself to the gravity of the Sultan's residence. From the first courtyard, she was led through the gate of salutation, Bab-us-Selam, into the second courtyard. Here the air shifted again. This space was no longer open to the common petitioners. Only officials and those with duty to perform might enter. The architecture changed subtly, the space narrowing, the buildings taller, the air quieter. The concubine would feel that the city outside was now completely gone, muffled behind thick stone walls, its noise and chaos replaced by the steady rhythm of palace life. She had passed a barrier, one of many, and with each step she was being drawn deeper into a world designed to separate her from her past and bind her to a new order. The second courtyard was grander, structured with offices, the palace kitchens, and the divan chambers, where the imperial council met. The girl may not have understood the significance of these chambers then, but she would feel the weight of the place, knowing that decisions of war, peace, and tribute were made only steps away. The quiet was punctuated by the sound of fountains, the rustle of cypress trees in the breeze, the echo of footsteps across flagstones. Guards stood motionless along the pathways, their armor gleaming faintly in the filtered light. Here the separation between the ordinary and the imperial became unmistakable, but it was not yet the end. From the second courtyard, she would pass through the Gate of Felicity, Bab-us-Sadet. This was the true boundary. To cross this gate was to leave behind even the echo of the public world, and to enter the innermost sphere of the Sultan himself. Beyond lay the third courtyard, where the Sultan's private apartments, the treasury, and the harem itself were hidden. For the concubine, this was the moment of enclosure. From here on, her life would be lived behind screens and locked doors, visible only to those within, invisible to the rest of the empire. The experience of crossing these gates was overwhelming, not because of noise or chaos, but because of its increasing silence. Each threshold reduced the sounds of the outside world, each step narrowed the horizon. The girl may have looked back only once, perhaps catching a last glimpse of the outer courtyards, of the faint skyline of the city beyond the walls. But once the gates closed behind her, that view was lost. The harem did not allow for wandering or looking outward. Life would be measured instead by corridors, chambers, small gardens, and windows carved with lattices that permitted vision outward, but denied any chance of escape. For those entering, the gates were also symbols of permanence. The palace was not designed as a place one entered freely and left again. It was a space that absorbed those within it. Servants might leave at the end of their duty, ambassadors might pass through with permission, but concubines were not permitted such movement. Their entrance was one-directional. To cross into the harem was to be bound to it, whether for a few years or for a lifetime. The palace became both protector and captor. The atmosphere was carefully constructed to impress this reality. The eunuchs who led the newcomers said little. Their silence conveyed the sense that no explanation was necessary. The buildings themselves spoke instead: the scale of the walls, the geometry of arches, the calligraphy inscriptions, repeating verses from the Quran, or praising the Sultan, the order of courtyards leading always inward, never outward. For the concubine, the effect was disorienting, even dreamlike. The palace seemed less a place of residence than a carefully arranged vision, where each step was meant to strip away her past and remind her of her new place. Crossing the gates was also a ritual of separation. With each courtyard, she was not only being introduced to the grandeur of the palace, but also being distanced from her own identity. By the time she reached the harem, she would already feel herself cut off from what had come before. Family, homeland, language. Those memories would fade with time, replaced by the endless repetition of palace life. Thus the arrival and the passage through the gates was not merely a physical transition, but a symbolic one. It marked the beginning of enclosure, the entry into a place where silence and structure defined existence. The gates of Topkapı were thresholds not only of space but of identity, and for the concubine, stepping across them was the first step into the long, slow unfolding of life within the imperial harem. The earliest period of a concubine's life within the harem was not one of glamour or luxury, but of silence, repetition, and discipline. Upon passing through the final gates and entering the harem proper, the young women who arrived were not immediately transformed into companions of the Sultan, nor did they step into the shimmering silks and jeweled halls of imagination. Instead, they began in the lowest rank as novices. This stage of life was devoted almost entirely to erasing the traces of their pasts and carefully reshaping them into women who could live within the controlled order of the palace. It was a process of training that could last years, and for many, it was the entire span of their existence within the harem. The life of an Asemi was one of strict routines. Each morning began at dawn, when the call to prayer carried faintly across the palace walls. Even within the hidden chambers of the harem, the rhythm of the empire was marked by these 5 daily calls, and from the beginning, the novices were taught to rise with them, washing themselves and performing prayers under the supervision of attendants. It was both a spiritual act and a lesson in discipline. Every movement was regulated, every task observed, until the actions became second nature. The silence of these mornings set the tone for the day. Voices were kept low, movements quiet, as if the very stones of the palace demanded restraint. The training itself was wide in scope, for the harem was not simply a place of waiting but a school of refinement. The girls learned the Turkish language, if they did not already speak it, along with Arabic for religious study and Persian for poetry. Language lessons were delivered patiently but firmly, with repetition that stretched across months. A concubine might begin by learning the names of objects within her chamber, the words for food, clothing, prayers. Over time she was expected to read aloud, to write simple lines in calligraphy, and eventually to recite verses from memory. It was not unusual for the women of the harem to become well versed in literature and poetry, even if they would never leave the confines of the palace. Alongside language came lessons in manners and comportment. The girls were taught how to move with grace, how to bow properly, how to keep their eyes lowered in the presence of superiors. They learned to walk slowly, their steps measured, their voices restrained. Even laughter was subdued, shaped into a soft expression rather than a loud burst. The training aimed not simply to discipline, but to create an atmosphere where every woman was a reflection of the Sultan's dignity, even if he never saw her. In this way, the palace molded its inhabitants into living symbols of refinement. There were also practical skills. Needlework and embroidery were essential, both as tasks to fill the endless hours and as displays of skill. A concubine might spend days bent over fabric, stitching patterns of flowers, calligraphy, or geometric designs. Her work added to the collections of garments and textiles that filled the palace storerooms. Music was another part of training. Girls were taught to play instruments such as the oud, the ney flute, or the quorum, their lessons overseen by instructors brought into the palace for this purpose. They also learned to sing in quiet, measured tones, performing pieces of Ottoman classical music that had been passed down across generations. Together, these skills made them not only ornaments of the harem, but participants in its cultural life, where evenings were sometimes filled with music, poetry, and the soft hum of shared activity. Religious education formed another cornerstone of training. The harem was not merely a place of worldly beauty, but also of piety, at least in form. Quran recitation was part of the daily schedule, with older women, or specially appointed instructors guiding the novices. They memorized verses, learned their meanings, and were instructed in the rituals of ablution, fasting, and prayer. For many of these women, religion became both a comfort and a structure, a way to endure the long hours of confinement with purpose. It also reinforced the moral order of the palace. Obedience to God mirrored obedience to the Sultan, and discipline in prayer reflected discipline in life. The silence of training years was not only external, but internal. The young concubines quickly realized that their personal histories had little place here. Family names were forgotten, old languages faded, memories dulled with time. In their place grew a shared identity as members of the harem, bound by the same rules, the same routines. Friendships formed, though cautiously, for rivalry was always present beneath the surface. But in these early years, companionship was often the only solace, as girls whispered to one another in the quiet hours, sharing fragments of memory before they faded entirely. The hierarchy of the harem was always present, and the novices were reminded daily of their low position. They served the higher-ranked women, fetched water, carried clothing, or assisted in baths. These tasks were not humiliating but instructive, meant to teach them humility and to accustom them to service. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, ruled over the harem with unquestioned authority, and even in the training years, the concubines were made aware that her word was law. Beneath her were the women of higher rank, some of whom had borne children. others who had once been favored by the Sultan. The novices glimpsed these figures occasionally, moving with slow dignity through the corridors, their silks trailing behind them, their attendants following in silence. Such glimpses served both as a reminder of what could be achieved, and as a distant echo of a life few would ever touch. Time in the training years passed slowly, almost indistinguishably. Days blurred into one another, marked only by prayer times, lessons, meals, and the long hours of practice. A girl might spend weeks learning a single piece of music, or months perfecting a style of embroidery. The seasons shifted outside, visible only through lattice windows, or in the brief moments when the women were permitted into the gardens. Yet inside the palace, life remained constant. The air was filled with the faint smell of incense, the rustle of fabric, the soft clatter of wooden sandals against stone floors. For some, the training years were a burden, a slow erasure of the self. For others, they were a source of stability, offering food, clothing, and shelter in a world that outside was uncertain and often violent. Within these walls, the concubines were safe from war, famine, or abandonment, though the price of safety was confinement. The palace was both sanctuary and prison, and every novice learned this truth in time. The silent training years were, in essence, the foundation of harem life. They produced women who were skilled, disciplined, obedient, and capable of fitting into the delicate order of the imperial household. The harem was not a place of unstructured idleness or loose gatherings of women, as later imaginations often painted it. Rather, it was a world defined by a rigid hierarchy, where each step of advancement carried both privileges and burdens, and where every woman knew her place within the intricate order. Life within the imperial harem could be understood only by recognizing this structure, for it determined daily existence, the distribution of tasks, the degree of freedom allowed, and even the chances of being noticed by the Sultan. The women who entered its gates were not equals. They were carefully arranged into a system where obedience flowed upward, and authority was exercised in descending layers, much like the empire outside the palace walls. At the very base of this structure were the asime, the novices. These were the newest arrivals, often still young, unfamiliar with Ottoman customs, and sometimes barely able to speak the language. Their training, as described before, involved religious education, learning Turkish, practicing manners, and acquiring skills like embroidery and music. They had no privileges, and no authority. They served those above them, and lived under constant supervision. Many never rose beyond this level, spending their years in humble service until they grew older, and were quietly married off to officials or retired to more modest lives outside the palace. Those who advanced became odalisques, a term often misunderstood in Western imagination. The odalisques were not companions of the Sultan. Rather, they were attendants, serving the higher-ranking women of the harem. They carried clothing, tended to baths, prepared cosmetics, and performed the countless small tasks that kept the palace running. Their lives revolved around service. Yet, this role brought them into closer contact with the women of influence, and sometimes, through loyalty or skill, an odalisques could attract attention that led to advancement. Above the odalisques were the concubines proper, sometimes called carrier. These were women who had completed training, who were considered suitable for possible service to the Sultan himself. They were not all lovers of the Sultan, as popular myths would later suggest, for his attentions could extend only to a small number at any given time. Instead, most concubines lived within the harem, as part of its disciplined structure, contributing their skills in music, embroidery, or religious devotion. Their value measured not only by beauty, but also by obedience and usefulness. Yet, because they were part of the Sultan's personal household, they held higher standing than the odalisques, and were treated with more respect. Among the concubines, a smaller group might emerge as favorites, known as Gözde or Iqbal. These were women who had drawn the Sultan's attention, whether through beauty, charm, intelligence, or simple fortune. Being chosen by the Sultan was a turning point, for it meant greater privileges, better quarters, fine clothing, attendants of their own, and influence within the harem. A favorite might dine with more delicacy, walk with more confidence, and carry herself with the knowledge that others watched her closely. But this attention also came with risk. Falling out of favor could mean a swift return to obscurity, a decline that could be humiliating after once tasting prominence. The life of a favorite was precarious, balanced on the shifting tides of imperial affection. If a favorite bore a child, especially a son, her status rose again, for she became a mother of a prince, known as Haseki. The Haseki Sultan was among the most powerful women in the empire, often granted her own apartments, and endowed with wealth. Her influence could extend far beyond the harem, for as the mother of a possible future sultan, her position was central to the dynasty's continuity. Some Hasekis wielded extraordinary political power, shaping the empire's policies through their counsel to the sultan. Their lives were still confined by the harem's walls, yet their words could ripple outward into the entire realm. At the summit of this hierarchy stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. She was, without question, the most powerful woman in the empire, second only to the sultan himself in the palace order. The Valide Sultan ruled the harem with authority that extended over every concubine, every attendant, every eunuch within its walls. She controlled appointments, decided promotions, arranged marriages for women who were no longer needed, and monitored the sultan's favorites with a careful eye. The Valide Sultan also possessed immense wealth, often holding estates and revenues in her own name, and she could intervene in matters of state through her influence over her son. To defy her was unthinkable. To please her was essential for survival. This strict hierarchy was not merely theoretical, but was reinforced daily in the routines of harem life. Meals were served according to rank, with the higher women receiving the finest dishes and the novices eating simpler fare. Clothing reflected status, with silks and jewels reserved for the upper ranks, while the novices wore plainer garments. The order of movement also revealed hierarchy. When women walked through the corridors, those of higher rank were given space, and the lower women bowed their heads in respect. Even speech was regulated, with novices forbidden from addressing superiors without permission. The hierarchy also extended into space. The harem was itself a series of chambers and apartments arranged to reflect rank. The novices lived in the simplest dormitories, their shared quarters filled with the quiet rustle of many bodies, their belongings limited to what the palace provided. As one advanced, the chambers grew more private, with favorites and mothers of princes occupying elegant rooms adorned with tiles, carpets, and latticed windows overlooking the gardens. The Valide Sultan resided in the most magnificent apartments, her rooms decorated with calligraphy, marble, and precious tiles, her presence marked by the constant attendance of servants. For the women living within this order, the hierarchy was both a pathway and a barrier. It offered the possibility of advancement, a slow climb from obscurity to prominence, yet it also fixed each woman in her place, reminding her daily of the limits of her power. Rivalries could be sharp, as women sought to gain the sultan's attention or to secure the favor of the Valide Sultan, but they were always tempered by the knowledge that disobedience or arrogance could lead to punishment, exile, or being quietly removed from the palace. The eunuchs who oversaw the harem reinforced this order, ensuring that every woman remained in her proper place. They maintained records of rank, monitored movements, and delivered instructions from the Valide Sultan. Their authority was absolute within the women's quarters, and they were both feared and respected. Their presence was another reminder that the harem was not simply a household but an institution of the state, as disciplined and hierarchical as the army or the imperial council. To live within this hierarchy was to accept that every aspect of existence was shaped by it: what one ate, where one slept, how one spoke, whom one could serve, even the hope of future advancement. The concubine who dreamed of rising higher might spend years waiting in silence, practicing embroidery, playing music, and performing her duties, always watched, always measured against others. For most, the climb would stop long before reaching the upper levels, and the dream would fade into the simple acceptance of service. Yet for a few, fortune might intervene, and the path upward would open. The hierarchy of the harem was thus both a ladder and a cage. It offered direction, stability, and the possibility of rising through obedience, but it also enclosed the women in a structure that left little room for personal freedom. Each woman carried the weight of her rank, whether high or low, and her life unfolded accordingly, within the carefully ordered silence of the imperial harem. Life within the imperial harem was not marked by sudden events or dramatic turns, at least not for the vast majority of its inhabitants. Instead, it unfolded in a long sequence of carefully regulated days, each one flowing into the next with little to distinguish morning from evening, one week from the following, one season from the last. For the concubine, daily existence was built upon repetition, the slow rhythm of rising, attending to personal grooming, learning the skills expected of her, and retreating once more into sleep. This monotony was not accidental. It was designed, imposed by the palace order, and reinforced by the silent authority of the eunuchs and the elder women. A day in the harem was not simply a unit of time, but a carefully measured fragment of a life that belonged not to the individual, but to the institution of the Ottoman dynasty. The day began early. Before the first light of dawn touched the domes and courtyards of Topkapı Palace, the concubines were already stirring from their beds. The novice girls, sleeping in shared dormitories, awoke to the sound of eunuchs' footsteps echoing through the corridors, or the distant call to prayer, rising faintly from the mosques of Istanbul. They rose quietly, each movement performed with restraint, for noise was discouraged. Conversation, if it occurred at all, was hushed, a murmur quickly silenced by the sharp glance of an overseer. Beds were folded away, rooms tidied, and bodies prepared for the day with the same precise regularity as on the day before. Bathing was not a luxury, but an integral part of discipline. Cleanliness, both of body and clothing, was expected at all times. The concubines made their way, sometimes in small groups, to the baths within the harem, their steps muffled by the stone floors, their movements watched by attendants who ensured that order was maintained even in these private rituals. The baths themselves were marvels of Ottoman architecture, with domed ceilings pierced by tiny star-shaped openings that filtered daylight in faint streams, steam rising softly through the air, marble basins echoing the steady trickle of warm water. To bathe there was not indulgence but routine, the washing of hair, the scrubbing of skin, the careful attention to appearance that reminded each concubine that her body was no longer her own possession, but a part of the sultan's household, to be maintained for service and for display. After bathing, the concubines dressed in simple garments according to their rank. Novices wore plain cottons, higher-ranking women might be permitted silks of subdued colors, though the most elaborate fabrics and jewels were reserved for favorites and mothers of princes. Appearance was never careless. Hair was combed with precision, garments adjusted with neat folds, slippers placed properly on the feet. Disorder was seen as negligence, and negligence was swiftly corrected by senior women, or the ever-watchful eunuchs. The quiet uniformity of dress further reinforced the sense that individuality was not the point of harem life. Rather, the palace demanded discipline, order, and harmony. Meals were another point of silent regulation. Food was plentiful but never extravagant for the lower ranks. Simple dishes of bread, rice, stewed vegetables, and occasionally lamb or chicken were provided, served at regular intervals. Novices and odalisques ate together in common halls, seated in ordered rows, their chatter subdued, their hands trained to handle food with cleanliness and restraint. Favorites and higher-ranking women dined apart, receiving more refined dishes, prepared with the delicacy of palace kitchens that were capable of feeding thousands. Meals were not a time of freedom or leisure, but an extension of the harem's order, a moment in which one's place in the hierarchy was again made visible through portion, preparation, and company. Lessons filled much of the day. For the novices, this meant long hours of instruction in religion, as they memorized verses of the Quran, repeated prayers, and absorbed the moral lessons expected of women, destined for the Sultan's household. Language was also central. Those who arrived without Turkish learned it through repetition, copying words and phrases, listening closely to their instructors, and slowly gaining fluency. For many, this was the most difficult task, for it required not only skill, but also the erasure of old tongues, old songs, and old expressions from faraway homelands. Music formed another part of the training. The concubines were taught to sing in the styles favored at court, to play instruments such as the oud or tambour, their fingers moving steadily over strings as they repeated the same melodies again and again until skill became second nature. Embroidery and weaving occupied many hours as well, the slow work of needles tracing patterns onto cloth, hands repeating the same gestures for days, weeks, years, until they could reproduce the delicate floral motifs that decorated the garments and furnishings of the palace. Afternoons often passed in similar silence. Lessons gave way to service, with odalisques attending to the needs of higher women, cleaning chambers, arranging garments, or assisting in the elaborate preparations for baths or meals. The rhythm of footsteps in corridors, the faint swish of fabric, the sound of keys turning in locks, these became the background music of harem life. The palace gardens offered moments of respite, though they too were bounded by walls and gates. The women might walk among fountains and cypress trees, but always under the watchful eyes of eunuchs, their freedom contained within latticed screens and hidden courtyards. The beauty of the gardens was undeniable, yet even there the silence of discipline persisted, the ordered placement of flowers and shrubs reflecting the ordered lives of the women who walked among them. Evenings returned the harem to its chambers, lessons concluded, meals eaten, prayers recited, the concubines withdrew into their quarters. For the novices, nights were filled with the hum of many bodies gathered together, the rustle of bedding, the low murmur of whispered words that faded quickly into sleep. For those higher in rank, evenings might bring preparation for possible summons by the Sultan, a ritual that involved careful bathing, the application of perfumes, the arrangement of garments and jewels, and the long waiting in silence, uncertain whether the call would come. Yet for most, the evenings ended as the mornings began, quietly, predictably, with bodies settling into sleep beneath the weight of repetition. The repetition was the essence of it. Days in the harem were not designed to vary but to train, to regulate, and to discipline. Over time the concubine might cease to distinguish one day from the next, each following the same pattern of waking, bathing, eating, learning and waiting. This monotony was part of the institution's power, for it wore down individuality and shaped women into the roles the palace required. A concubine who lived through such days learned patience, restraint and obedience, not through sudden instruction but through the slow grind of years, in which every movement, every word, every gesture was repeated until it became habit. The daily routine of the harem was therefore not only the structure of life, but also the means by which the palace maintained its order. It ensured that the hundreds of women living within its walls did not descend into chaos, but remained aligned to the hierarchy and purpose of the Sultan's household. For the individual concubine, the endless days could feel stifling, yet they were the foundation upon which the rare possibilities of advancement rested. Without this discipline, there could be no rise to favor, no chance of becoming more than a name lost among the many. Thus, as night settled again over the domes of Topkapı, and the call to prayer drifted across the city, the harem lay in silence, its women asleep within chambers of marble and wood, their dreams perhaps filled with memories of faraway homes or vague hopes of a different future. But the morning would come, as it always did, and with it the same routine, the same repetition, the same slow passage of time within the hidden world of the Ottoman Imperial Harem. The hammam of the harem was both a necessity and a ritual, a space where the concubines were reminded again and again of the palace's vision of order, cleanliness and refinement. To enter its chambers was to step into a world that felt suspended between silence and echo, where the weight of steam softened the air, and the faint smell of perfumed oils lingered on every surface. If the corridors of Topkapı were marked by restraint and whispers, the baths carried their own atmosphere, one of warmth, moisture, and the slow passage of time beneath domes built to collect both sound and light in a way that altered perception. The hammam was no modest chamber but a carefully designed sequence of rooms, each with its own function. First came the dressing halls, where women slipped from their garments and wrapped themselves in thin cloths, their bare feet treading softly across cool marble floors. Light filtered in through small circular glass openings in the domed ceiling, scattering onto polished stone surfaces in fragmented circles. The sound of water trickling through fountains blended with the low murmur of attendants who guided the women deeper inside. The hammam was never rushed. Its design encouraged lingering, the slow surrender of the body to steam and heat. Passing into the warm room, the concubines felt the air thicken, enveloping them in warmth that clung to skin and hair. The scent here was distinctive. The mineral tang of heated stone, the earthy richness of water drawn from deep cisterns, and the delicate undertone of rosewater or sandalwood oil added to basins by attendants. It was a scent that remained on their skin long after leaving, a reminder that the bath was not only about physical cleansing, but also about maintaining the fragrant refinement expected within the Sultan's court. At the heart of the hammam lay the hot room, the Göbek Taşı, a great raised platform of marble heated from beneath. Here the women reclined, allowing the warmth of the stone to sink slowly into their muscles. Hours passed in this chamber as steam collected under the domed ceiling, creating an atmosphere where time itself seemed to stretch and dissolve. The women did not speak loudly here. Voices carried easily, bouncing off marble and water, so conversation was muted. Little more than murmurs carried across the haze of steam. Attendants, often other women assigned to service, moved quietly from one to another, pouring warm water from brass ewers, the sound of it splashing into basins mingling with the constant rhythm of dripping condensation from the ceiling above. Ritual cleansing was central to the experience. Concubines scrubbed their skin with kisi mitts until it reddened, the dead cells sloughing away to leave a renewed smoothness. Attendants massaged their limbs with soap lather so thick it resembled clouds, the scent of olive oil or lavender filling the chamber as the foam spread across marble surfaces. Hair was washed with fragrant mixtures, rinsed repeatedly with warm water poured in steady streams from polished copper vessels. The process was not hurried. Each stage was deliberate, slow and repetitive, emphasizing discipline as much as comfort. To emerge from the hammam without the faint perfume of oils or the sheen of polished skin would be unthinkable within the palace order. There was also companionship, though never unguarded. Within the mist and warmth, the women of the harem shared a kind of collective intimacy, not one of friendship as much as shared condition. Their lives were bounded by the same walls, their futures shaped by the same hierarchy. In the hammam, their voices softened, their laughter muted, their presence briefly less restrained. Yet even here, hierarchy remained visible. Favorites and senior women received the most elaborate care, their attendants layering perfumes of amber or musk, wrapping them afterward in fine towels embroidered with gold thread. Novices waited their turn, using simpler oils and plainer cloths, their place in the order never forgotten. The baths were also places of preparation. For a concubine summoned to the Sultan, the hammam ritual took on greater significance, extending for hours, her body prepared with the most delicate unguents, her hair perfumed with rose essence, her skin rubbed with mixtures of saffron and almond oil. The process of cleansing became a transformation, erasing all traces of daily routine, presenting her anew as though sculpted for display. The scent of such preparations lingered in corridors long after she had left the hammam, a signal that she was ready for the possible gaze of power. But for most, the hammam was simply part of the weekly rhythm of palace life. It was a place to pass time, to experience the enveloping warmth of steam, to allow the body its ritual cleansing, and to emerge once again into the cool corridors of the harem. Hair damp, skin perfumed, senses slightly blurred by heat and quiet. The baths, though enclosed and hidden like every part of the harem, held their own kind of grandeur. Domes patterned with star-shaped openings, marble polished to a reflective sheen, brass basins gleaming faintly in the dim light. They were architectural reminders that even in confinement, the Ottoman court demanded refinement and beauty. When the ritual was complete, the concubines returned to the cooling rooms, where they sat wrapped in cloths, sipping sherbets or plain water, waiting for their bodies to adjust to the change in temperature. The air here felt light after the dense steam of the hot chambers, carrying faint scents of citrus peels or mint scattered in bowls to refresh the senses. Conversation, if it arose, was brief, subdued, often cut short by the presence of attendants. Eventually, the women dressed again in the simple garments of their rank, their hair still damp, their skin carrying the fragrance of oils, and stepped back into the quiet corridors of the harem, the baths left behind until the next appointed time. The hammam was, therefore, more than a bathhouse. It was a space where the palace's demands for discipline, Order and refinement were made tangible through water, steam and scent. It was where individuality was softened by ritual, where companionship was constrained by hierarchy, and where the hours passed in a haze of warmth that both soothed and confined. The concubine carried its atmosphere with her long after leaving, the faint fragrance of rose or sandalwood clinging to her garments, the memory of heat pressed into her skin, the silence of steam echoing in her thoughts. In this way, the baths were not only a physical space but also a recurring state of being within the long, slow life of the Ottoman harem. Life inside the harem unfolded not in loud voices or hurried movements, but in tones so subtle that they seemed at times to dissolve into the walls themselves. The passage of days was marked not by clocks or bells, but by rhythms of sound so faint and measured that one had to be attuned to them in order to sense the flow of time. The harem was a place of constant waiting, where silence dominated, yet within that silence were carefully arranged layers of music, whispered recitations and the hushed sounds of daily tasks. Together they created an atmosphere in which the concubines lived suspended between stillness and faint echoes, between an almost dreamlike quiet and the fragile music that seemed always on the verge of vanishing. Music lessons occupied an important place in this world of muted sound. In specially appointed chambers, concubines were taught the instruments of Ottoman classical music, the resonant strings of the oud, the delicate tones of the konan, the breathy, meditative flow of the ney flute. Lessons did not resemble the vigorous training of soldiers or apprentices in the outside world. They were slow, deliberate, and suffused with repetition. A concubine might spend an entire season learning to hold an instrument properly, to pluck or strike the strings with the gentleness that palace decorum demanded. The music produced was rarely loud, never urgent, always soft enough to blend with the air itself. The notes seemed to linger for a moment, and then vanish, leaving behind silence that felt even heavier in contrast. Poetry recitations formed another layer of sound. In the afternoons, groups of women would sit together and recite verses from Persian poets like Hafez or Rumi, or from Ottoman poets, whose works were filled with images of gardens, roses, nightingales, and the passage of time. The concubines were expected to memorize and repeat these verses, their voices controlled, their tones gentle. In a chamber lined with cushions and carpets, the sound of poetry was less like a performance and more like a murmur, blending with the rustling of fabrics or the faint hiss of oil lamps. Each word lingered, heavy with meaning, but carried softly, as though the palace itself demanded that beauty arrive, not with force, but with restraint. Embroidery circles carried their own music, though it was wordless. The quiet rustle of silk threads pulled through fabric, the faint click of needles against thimbles, and the sound of many women breathing in unison, created a rhythm that was at once meditative and monotonous. These circles could last for hours, the concubines seated together on low cushions, bent over cloth that would eventually be turned into garments, cushions, or decorative hangings for the palace. Conversation was minimal, limited to soft exchanges, for attention was expected to remain on the task. And yet, in the shared silence of embroidery, there was a kind of companionship, a recognition of common condition expressed not in words, but in the steady collective rhythm of threads moving through fabric. The marking of time within the harem was subtle, always tied to sound. The call to prayer drifting faintly across the palace grounds 5 times a day provided the most regular structure, a reminder that even in their enclosed world, the women were bound to the same religious rhythms as the empire beyond the walls. Within the harem, the summons to lessons, the soft footsteps of eunuchs in the corridors, the occasional strike of a drum or note of a flute drifting from the outer courts also hinted at the movement of hours, but much of the day was indistinguishable from what came before. And so the concubines came to know time by the repetition of small sounds, the scraping of bowls as meals were prepared and cleared, the distant trickle of fountains, the dull thud of doors closing and opening somewhere in the endless labyrinth of chambers. Silence itself was a constant presence, one that was carefully maintained. Laughter was rarely permitted to rise above a soft murmur, conversations were restrained, and even footsteps were expected to fall lightly against stone and carpet. The silence could feel oppressive, pressing in on the young women who had once known the noise of marketplaces, families, and villages outside. Yet in time, it became normal, a condition as natural as the air they breathed. In such silence, the faintest sounds, a bird outside the window lattice, the splash of water in a basin, the whispered note of a flute, seemed magnified, carrying a weight that might have gone unnoticed in a noisier world. At night, the soundscape of the harem shifted again. The corridors fell into deeper stillness, broken only by the shuffle of guards or the occasional murmur of women speaking in low tones to one another before sleep. Oil lamps hissed faintly, casting shadows against carved wooden screens. The concubines lay in their chambers, sometimes listening to the soft snores of companions, sometimes to the faint creak of timbers or the wind moving beyond the palace walls. In these hours, silence became not just the absence of sound, but the presence of anticipation. For the women never knew what the next day might bring, whether they would remain in their routine or be called forward into some new position within the hierarchy. The sounds of music and silence together formed the texture of the harem's life. They were not dramatic, not overwhelming, but carefully measured, disciplined, and restrained, like everything else within the palace walls. Through them, the women learned patience, endurance, and the art of finding meaning in repetition. A single note of music, a whispered verse of poetry, a thread drawn smoothly through fabric, these were the markers of existence, the sounds by which days passed, years accumulated, and lives unfolded quietly within the hidden chambers of the imperial court. In the quiet, regulated world of the Ottoman harem, faith was not merely a private practice, but a pervasive rhythm that structured the day and shaped every moment of a concubine's existence. The call to prayer, the adhan, echoed faintly across the palace grounds from the distant minarets of Istanbul, a gentle yet insistent reminder that life within the walls of Topkapı Palace was inseparable from the larger world of the empire and its religious observances. Even for those who had arrived from distant lands, their identities remade in the service of the Sultan, these calls marked the slow passage of time, punctuating the repetitive hours with a cadence that was at once external and intimately internalized. The 5 daily prayers were observed with diligence. Morning prayer, or fajr, arrived before dawn, often beginning the day for the concubines with a movement toward ritual purification. Washing hands, face and feet, performing the ablution known as wudu, was a quiet contemplative act, attended to in the marble-lined chambers or small ablution rooms within the harem. For novices and odalisques, this process was carefully supervised, part of their slow education in both religious practice and proper comportment. The air in these rooms often carried the faint fragrance of rosewater or citrus added to the basins, creating an environment in which the cleansing of the body mirrored the expected cleanliness of thought and spirit. During the dur and asr prayers of midday and late afternoon, the concubines would pause their embroidery, lessons or musical practice to engage in prayer. These moments were seldom accompanied by vocalization beyond the quietly murmured verses. Their observance was deliberate, restrained, and suffused with the awareness of hierarchy. Higher-ranking women might perform their prayers in slightly more private chambers, attended by servants, while novices and odalisques aligned themselves in rows, moving in unison through the postures of bowing, kneeling, and prostration. Even in these acts, order and decorum governed behavior. The physicality of prayer, the measured rhythm of breaths, the gentle swaying, the soft placement of hands on the floor, blended with the hush of the harem, reinforcing the constant interplay of discipline and devotion that defined life within the palace. The evening prayer, Maghrib, coincided with the soft fading of daylight across the palace courtyards. Light, filtered through latticed windows and carved wooden screens, fell in muted patterns across the floors, creating small shifting mosaics that seemed to move with the day's end. For a concubine, performing Maghrib was to move within both time and light, to participate in a ritual whose repetition linked her to countless generations beyond the palace walls. The faint sound of distant voices in mosques mingled with the quiet rustle of fabric and the careful footsteps of attendants, establishing an auditory backdrop that was at once calming and suffused with reverence. Isha, the night prayer, drew the day to a close. It was a moment of reflection, of quiet reckoning with the events of the hours just past. and of preparation for the long sleep that awaited. The harem, already softened by evening shadows, seemed to contract around the women, enveloping them in hushed resonance of the final prayer. Each movement, each bow, each whispered verse contributed to the unbroken thread of disciplined, spiritually oriented existence that had carried through decades of Ottoman life. Even those who might never advance beyond the rank of a sema were bound into this rhythm, their physical acts of worship, a subtle training in patience, obedience, and internal focus. Religious education extended beyond these daily prayers. Quran lessons were central to the intellectual and spiritual formation of the concubines. Tutors, or senior women, guided the novices through careful memorization of verses, the study of stories of prophets, and the comprehension of moral lessons intended to cultivate patience, humility, and a proper sense of piety. These sessions were quiet and methodical. A novice might spend hours reciting a few lines, listening to corrections, repeating and repeating again until pronunciation, intonation, and meaning became second nature. The repetition was slow, immersive, and over years, transformed the mundane into spiritual discipline. The harem was, in this sense, a world where time, labor, and devotion intersected. The scent of perfumed water from ablutions mingled with the soft rustle of silk and wool in embroidery halls. The faint, controlled voice of one reciting the Quran harmonized with the muted rhythm of daily work. The filtered light of latticed windows created spaces in which prayer, reflection, and preparation for service could unfold quietly. Every day was permeated by a spiritual cadence that structured the women's consciousness as subtly as it shaped their actions. For the higher-ranking women, the mother of the Sultan, and the favorites, this spiritual rhythm was often intertwined with politics and influence. Their piety could be displayed in small, measured ways, sponsoring recitations, attending prayers at particular hours with precision, ensuring that their observance was known to attendants, reinforcing the notion that spiritual discipline was inseparable from status and propriety. For the novices, however, the repetition of prayers, lessons, and ablutions primarily functioned as a slow shaping of habit, molding the body and mind to the harem's expectations. Even in the silence between prayers, the spiritual atmosphere persisted. The faint echo of earlier recitations, the gentle drip of water, the soft exhalations of women engaged in meditation or reflection, all contributed to a pervasive sense of the sacred as inseparable from the daily. It was not a loud, dramatic religiosity, but a quiet, immersive one, so interwoven with the measured pace of life that it became invisible in its constancy. The concubine's day was thus framed not merely by meals, lessons, or baths, but by the soft, insistent cadence of devotion, a rhythm that echoed through her body, mind, and surroundings, and carried her slowly through the long passage of years within the palace. In this way, the call to prayer was more than a summons. It was a reminder that life in the harem was a continuum, disciplined, structured, and always under the subtle guidance of faith. The concubine learned over years to read time in the Atan, to pace herself according to prayer, to carry the rhythm of devotion in her movements and thoughts, and to exist entirely within the ordered, spiritual cadence that bound the walls of Topkapı Palace to the vastness of the Ottoman Empire beyond. Within the vast, ordered labyrinth of the Ottoman harem, the moments when a concubine might be summoned before the Sultan were rare, fleeting, and steeped in a quiet tension that permeated every fiber of daily life. Most days passed in predictable repetition, rising, bathing, lessons, embroidery, prayer, meals, and the subdued companionship of others, living under the same strict hierarchy. Yet, always in the background of this rhythm was the possibility, the distant, almost imperceptible possibility, that a summons could arrive, carried by the eunuchs, bringing with it a shift in the delicate balance of routine and the fragile hope of advancement. The Sultan's attention was not sought through loud assertion or overt ambition, but through subtle excellence and careful presentation. The novices and odalisques learned quickly that every gesture mattered, the way one moved in the corridors, how one carried oneself in the baths, the precision of embroidery, the clarity of voice in recitation, and the gentleness of hands in music lessons. These small acts, repeated over months and years, built a reputation that could be noticed by the higher-ranking women, the chief attendants, and ultimately the eunuchs, who acted as intermediaries between the Sultan and the women of the harem. Each movement, Each measured smile or silence could contribute to the perception of suitability for elevation. Eunuchs played a central role in this process. They were both guardians and facilitators, their presence felt in every chamber, corridor, and courtyard. Among their many duties, they observed the behavior, demeanor, and appearance of the women, noting those who carried themselves with composure, who demonstrated the careful obedience and poise expected within the palace. When the Sultan's attention was requested or required, it was the eunuchs who delivered the summons, their presence both reassuring and formidable, their authority unquestioned. The young concubine, when approached by one of these figures, would feel the weight of expectation, a signal that her life might shift in subtle yet profound ways. Preparation for an audience with the Sultan began hours before any movement toward his presence. A concubine selected for inspection or favor would be guided to the baths, where she was meticulously cleansed and perfumed. Oils, rosewater, and scented powders were applied to hair and skin, enhancing both appearance and fragrance in accordance with palace ideals of beauty. Garments were carefully chosen according to rank and the occasion, the folds and layers arranged so that every line of fabric suggested refinement, elegance, and the harmonious blending of physical grace with internal composure. The process was slow and deliberate, a ritualized transition from the everyday routine into a state of presentation suitable for the Sultan's gaze. Once prepared, the concubine was escorted through the harem's corridors, her steps measured, her posture strict, each footfall muffled by the marble and carpeted floors. The eunuchs led her along passageways that curved, narrowed, and opened into small secluded chambers where the Sultan might appear. The air was thick with expectation, the faint scent of incense lingering from prior audiences, the echo of water from fountains and baths nearby, the quiet hum of servants attending to other tasks in distant corners. Time seemed to elongate in these passages, moments stretching into minutes, minutes into hours in the consciousness of a woman acutely aware of the eyes, both real and imagined, that might be upon her. The audience itself, when it occurred, was often brief. The Sultan's glance could last only moments, yet its implications rippled outward, affecting daily routines, social standing, and the future trajectory of a concubine's life. Favor was subtle, a prolonged look, a nod, the suggestion of attention rather than overt proclamation. For those not called forward, life continued unchanged, the daily routine resuming with its quiet discipline. For those summoned, the aftermath was measured in small shifts, a better room, a slight relaxation of certain duties, or over months and years, increased access to resources, influence, and status within the palace hierarchy. Yet even in anticipation, the concubines did not experience this attention as drama or excitement in the modern sense. The tension was internalized, slow-burning, filtered through the decades of habit that the harem instilled. Fear and hope coexisted in equal measure, fear of misstep, of failing to meet expectations, of displeasing the Sultan or the supervising eunuchs. Hope of subtle recognition, of incremental advancement, of an altered position in the unyielding hierarchy. The life of a concubine was thus defined by such moments, small, almost imperceptible, yet carrying the weight of years of preparation, discipline, and careful attention to the smallest details of conduct, appearance, and demeanor. The eunuchs in their steady presence reinforced this tension. They were reminders that no action occurred in isolation, that every step, every gesture, every note sung or line embroidered was being silently observed, catalogued, and interpreted. The concubine walked under their watchful gaze, not only to maintain order, but also to understand that her existence, and her potential future, was inseparable from their judgment. Their roles were both protective and regulatory. They shielded the women from external danger, while simultaneously ensuring the palace's strict codes of behavior were followed without deviation. Thus, the Sultan's glance, whether anticipated, received, or never extended, defined an invisible rhythm within the harem. The long hours of preparation, the quiet repetition of routine, the measured pace of daily life, all coalesced around this possibility. For the women, life continued, seemingly unchanged, yet every action was subtly influenced by the awareness that favor, attention, or the absence thereof, could shift the trajectory of a life bound entirely within the palace walls. every whispered conversation, every careful movement in the corridors, every note plucked from a stringed instrument, and every verse recited from the Koran or poetic anthology was performed with an understanding of this potential gaze. The Sultan's glance that, whether fleeting or prolonged, could redefine years of patience, discipline, and silent endurance. Within the secluded and highly regulated world of the Ottoman Harem, the eunuchs occupied a position of both authority and omnipresence that was difficult to perceive from the outside. They were neither concubines nor ordinary servants, yet their influence penetrated every aspect of life within the palace walls. Silent observers, guardians and intermediaries, eunuchs ensured that the carefully maintained order of the harem persisted without disruption, their presence at once protective, regulatory, and for those living under their constant observation, quietly intimidating. To the women they were both a stabilizing force and a reminder that even within the walls of apparent confinement, power was exercised in subtle, pervasive ways. The authority of the eunuchs derived from their unique role. Castrated as boys or adolescents and brought into the palace, they were trained to navigate the intricate politics of the court, while remaining physically removed from the vulnerabilities and passions that might otherwise compromise their loyalty. Their duties were manifold. They oversaw the daily routines of the concubines, escorted women to baths and audiences with the Sultan, regulated the flow of servants and attendants, and acted as intermediaries between the women and the Sultan himself. Within this system, their word was seldom questioned. It carried the weight of palace authority, and was inseparable from the broader hierarchies that structured life in Topkapı Palace. Despite their authority, eunuchs were trained to move quietly, to act as invisible hands guiding the life of the harem, without unnecessary interference. They observed more than they spoke, and their silence was a form of control as much as their spoken commands. A eunuch's gaze could communicate approval, disapproval, or caution without a single word, and the concubines quickly learned to interpret these subtleties. Every footstep, every glance, and every interaction was measured against the invisible standard set by these guardians, who understood that discipline and obedience were reinforced as much through presence as the watchfulness of the eunuchs extended beyond mere surveillance. They managed schedules, ensured adherence to ritual and hygiene, and maintained the physical and psychological boundaries of the harem. Their authority was both structural and symbolic. The women of the harem knew that the walls and gates, though protective, were not the sole guardians of their confined world. The eunuchs were the living embodiment of oversight, the silent arbiters of order, who ensured that the hierarchy, the rituals, and the intricate social codes of palace life were never disrupted. To the novices especially, who had arrived from distant lands with no understanding of Ottoman protocol, the eunuch's presence was a constant and sometimes daunting reminder of the rules they had to learn and follow. Within the marble halls and curtained corridors, eunuchs moved with a subtle choreography. Their steps were quiet, measured, and predictable, the sound of their presence blending with the hushed echoes of water from fountains, the soft rustle of garments, or the faint murmur of recitations. Yet in this quietude, they projected authority. The concubines learned quickly that the presence of a eunuch near a chamber, a doorway, or a corridor could transform the atmosphere, reminding all of the hierarchical structure that governed not just access to the Sultan, but the ordering of daily life itself. Eunuchs were also conduits of information, observing, listening, and reporting as necessary. The smallest infraction, the softest complaint, or the slightest indication of dissent might be noted and conveyed up the hierarchy. Yet they balanced this power with discretion, understanding that overt displays of authority could unsettle the delicate equilibrium of the harem. Their role demanded patience, observation, and a nuanced understanding of the interplay between rank, etiquette, and influence among the concubines. In this sense, they were not only guards but diplomats, shaping the internal environment through measured intervention rather than overt force. The authority of eunuchs extended to ceremonial and functional aspects as well. They guided women to the baths, to prayer, and to the Sultan's presence, orchestrating movement in a way that reinforced hierarchy without apparent imposition. Their voices, when raised, were calm and firm, rarely emotional, their instructions precise and unambiguous. A novice who faltered under their watchful eyes would quickly learn the consequences of inattentiveness, while a favored concubine might experience a gentler form of supervision, her proximity to the eunuch a subtle sign of status within the rigid hierarchy. Over time, the presence of eunuchs shaped the perception of space itself. The corridors, rooms and courtyards of the harem were not simply architectural elements, but stages upon which interactions were measured, relationships monitored, and the flow of daily life orchestrated. A eunuch in a particular chamber signaled the proximity of authority. A eunuch stationed near the entrance of a garden or bath signaled regulation of access and control. The women learned to navigate these cues as intuitively as they learned their prayers, embroidery patterns or musical scales, understanding that the eunuch's presence was inseparable from the invisible web of discipline and expectation that defined their lives. In this way, the world of the eunuchs was both omnipresent and invisible, a network of oversight that reinforced order, hierarchy, and ritual in ways that were slow, subtle, and immersive. They were not only guardians of space but also arbiters of behavior, shaping the rhythm of life in the harem without dramatic intervention, yet with consequences that were deeply felt. The concubines in turn internalized this oversight, their movements, gestures, and even thoughts attuned to the ever-present, watchful gaze of these men whose silence spoke louder than any command. Thus, the eunuchs' authority was a quiet, omnipresent force that structured life in the harem, mediating the flow of routine, ritual, and potential favor. They were both protectors and regulators, their disciplined presence intertwined with the daily lives of concubines who moved through a world defined by repetition, hierarchy, and the possibility of subtle change. Their role, largely invisible to the outside observer, was a crucial element in maintaining the delicate balance of power, expectation, and routine that governed the hidden life of the Ottoman palace. In the carefully orchestrated world of the Ottoman harem, the moment a concubine received the Sultan's favor was both rare and transformative, a pivot upon which the slow rhythm of her life could shift in ways that were subtle yet profound. Favor was not a sudden or dramatic event in the sense of modern spectacle. It unfolded through ritualized, measured gestures, and was suffused with an almost imperceptible tension that could stretch across hours, days, or even years. The concubine's life, once marked by the quiet repetition of training, duties, and observation, was subtly reframed from the instant she was recognized, her standing elevated within the rigid hierarchy that structured every aspect of the harem. The process leading to this recognition was slow and ceremonial. The concubine might first receive notice through intermediaries, often the eunuchs who carried instructions from the Sultan or the mother of the Sultan. Preparations began immediately, but with deliberate care, reflecting the palace's demand for composure, cleanliness, and refinement. She was guided to the baths for extended purification, the warm steam enveloping her while oils and fragrant powders were applied with meticulous attention. Clothing was carefully arranged to display elegance, grace, and propriety. Colors and fabrics were chosen to complement her complexion and posture, ensuring that the first impression conveyed the combination of beauty, discipline, and poise demanded by court etiquette. Every fold, every scent, every line of posture was a measured element in the slow unfolding of ceremony. The escort to the Sultan's presence was deliberate, emphasizing both the gravity and formality of the occasion. Eunuchs led the concubine through the maze-like corridors of the harem, their movements precise and silent, signaling to all observers that this was a moment of significance. To the faint sounds of water dripping from fountains, the hushed murmur of attendants, and the soft rustle of fabric created an ambient backdrop in which every sensory detail was heightened. Even as the corridors themselves seemed ordinary, they were charged with expectation as the concubine approached the threshold of her altered status. The audience itself was restrained and highly controlled. The Sultan's attention often conveyed through the slightest gesture, a prolonged glance, a nod, or a subtle indication was at once private and public within the confines of the chamber. The moment of recognition did not involve overt declarations but was understood by all who witnessed it. A concubine had been singled out, elevated above the routine of ordinary service, and granted a degree of influence and privilege that was invisible to outsiders. Life thereafter was subtly reshaped, as her rank among peers changed, her access to resources increased, and her interactions with both the Sultan and other members of the harem were recalibrated according to the new hierarchy. this elevation carried practical consequences as well. The favored concubine might be moved to a larger or more luxurious chamber within the harem, provided with finer garments and attended by a greater number of servants. Her daily routine, though still governed by discipline and ritual, gained new flexibility, allowing for extended leisure, deeper engagement with musical or literary training, and in some cases closer involvement in palace politics. Even the seemingly small privileges, a particular place at a meal, a chance to attend to the Sultan more regularly, or the presence of attendants who conveyed messages or requests, cumulatively reinforced the perception and reality of her new status. Yet the psychological impact of this moment was perhaps even more profound than the material changes it entailed. The concubine internalized the recognition as validation of years of measured behavior, disciplined practice, and patient adherence to the hierarchy of the harem. Where once her life was marked by quiet repetition and observation, it now carried the subtle awareness that she had achieved a form of distinction. This awareness reshaped her interactions with peers, her perception of routine, and her understanding of potential influence within the palace. Even small gestures, carefully managed words, or strategic acts of etiquette were now colored by her position, reflecting an internalized sense of importance tempered by continued discipline. The moment of favor also reinforced the harem's broader system of control. By elevating a select few, the palace maintained the hierarchy, encouraged obedience, and demonstrated the tangible rewards of discipline and composure. The quiet, almost imperceptible ceremony of recognition served to remind all concubines that life in the harem was structured, predictable, and contingent upon both adherence to rules and the slow accumulation of merit in the eyes of those who held ultimate authority. Favor was, in this sense, both a personal reward and a mechanism of governance, a way to manage behavior through subtle reinforcement rather than overt coercion. Even after the initial moment, life for a favored concubine remained slow and immersive. Days continued to follow the rhythm of bathing, lessons, music, prayer, and embroidery, but these tasks were now experienced with the added dimension of elevated status. The concubine's presence in corridors, her movement through gardens, her engagement in ritual and education, all carried the quiet dignity of someone recognized by the Sultan. The environment itself seemed to shift subtly, the attention of attendants, the proximity of eunuchs, and even the interactions with other women were tinged with deference and recognition. Thus, the moment of favor was not a dramatic spectacle but a measured, almost invisible turning point in the concubine's life. It reshaped her standing, subtly altered the flow of daily routines, and imbued every action with the quiet weight of recognition. Over time, the accumulation of such moments, small adjustments in privilege, attention, and status, constructed a new layer of experience within the palace. A life marked not only by discipline and repetition, but also by the slow, immersive awareness of being singled out in a world defined by hierarchy, ritual, and enduring expectations. Within the hidden world of the Ottoman Harem, life was not only shaped by rituals, prayer, music, and the measured rhythm of favor, but also by subtler, less tangible currents that threaded quietly through every corridor, chamber, and garden. Among these, jealousy and rivalry constituted an almost invisible yet pervasive force, shaping relationships, behavior, and the delicate balance of power within the enclosed female world. The shadow of jealousy was rarely overt, rarely dramatic. Instead, it existed as a slow, persistent undercurrent, influencing interactions in ways so gradual and carefully moderated that it could be sensed more than seen, felt more than described. The harem, though physically segregated from the outer world, mirrored the hierarchies, ambitions, and competitions that existed in society at large. Every concubine, every odalisque, and even the most junior novice was aware that favor was scarce and attention could shift unpredictably. The Sultan's glance, the subtle acknowledgement of the Valide Sultan, or even the smallest sign of preference could alter the dynamics of entire chambers. In this environment, jealousy was rarely expressed openly. Loud quarrels or confrontations were prohibited by strict rules of decorum, and the presence of eunuchs ensured that overt dissent was swiftly controlled. Instead, jealousy manifested in quiet observation, cautious avoidance, measured conversation, and the subtle adjustments of body language and tone. The slow accumulation of rivalry began in the earliest stages of harem life. Novices who arrived with little knowledge of courtly expectations quickly became aware of the delicate web of relationships that governed access, status, and attention. Observing which women received greater privileges, who had the confidence of attendants or eunuchs, and who seemed likely to gain the Sultan's notice, became an almost daily exercise in assessment and calculation. These early perceptions laid the foundation for feelings of envy or aspiration, which would evolve over years into carefully managed strategies of social positioning, deference, and restraint. Hierarchy itself was both a cause and a framework for jealousy. The division of the harem into novices, odalisques, concubines, favorites, and the mother of the sultan created a visible ladder of status, one that was constantly monitored and subtly enforced. Women in lower ranks observed those above with a mixture of awe, desire, and quiet competitiveness, noting what behaviors, skills, or appearances seemed to earn recognition. Even for those who had achieved some degree of favor, vigilance was necessary. A younger or more skilled woman might arrive, a new novice might catch the attention of a eunuch, or shifts in the sultan's preferences might quietly realign the balance of influence. Each change, however minor, became a potential source of tension and careful recalibration of alliances and conduct. Rivalry was expressed in small, controlled ways: a glance exchanged in a corridor, a measured tone in conversation, the deliberate placement of objects during embroidery or musical instruction, all could carry implications of subtle contestation. These acts were slow, almost imperceptible, yet they accumulated into a persistent network of psychological pressure. Women learned to navigate this environment with careful observation, gauging when to step forward, when to withdraw, when to assert competence, and when to defer. The silent negotiation of attention and status shaped every action, every word, every measured gesture. Even intimacy and companionship were tempered by suspicion. Alliances formed between women could be supportive, providing comfort, shared learning, and moments of emotional respite. Yet these bonds were never without the risk of tension. Trust was measured, cautiously extended, and continually reassessed. In conversations, laughter, and shared tasks, women learned to detect the faintest hints of envy, the subtle recalibration of favor, and the quiet assertion of influence. Friendships were thus delicate, carefully maintained, and when necessary, withdrawn, as the shadow of jealousy lingered in every interaction. The slow weight of rivalry also influenced the broader structure of palace life. The hierarchy of the harem was reinforced not only by the sultan and the eunuchs, but by the women themselves, who monitored one another's behavior and compliance with rules. Jealousy, when managed carefully, became a tool for survival. By understanding the ambitions and resentments of peers, a concubine could position herself advantageously, avoid missteps, and anticipate shifts in favor. In this sense, rivalry was both a challenge and a subtle form of guidance, shaping behavior in a manner consistent with the disciplined, measured rhythms of the palace. Even in the moments of seeming stillness, the quiet of baths, the hushed tones of Quran lessons, the slow unfolding of embroidery or music practice, the undercurrent of jealousy persisted. It was never loud or immediate, but it influenced attention, interaction, and perception. The favored concubine might walk more carefully, aware of the silent assessments of those around her. A novice might hesitate in movement, careful not to attract negative notice. The eunuchs, while neutral enforcers of rules, could become subtle arbiters in this network, their observation magnifying the stakes of behavior and positioning. Over time, this quiet tension became an accepted, almost imperceptible part of life within the harem. Women internalized it as part of the environment, learning to live within the boundaries of hierarchy, favor, and social negotiation. The shadow of jealousy was never acknowledged directly, yet it shaped the pacing of days, the rhythm of routine, and the internal landscapes of thought and emotion. In a space where every gesture, glance, and word carried meaning, even the smallest ripple of envy could have significance, influencing interactions and subtly reinforcing the disciplined hierarchical order of palace life. Thus, the shadow of jealousy was both a personal and structural force, threading slowly and persistently through the lives of the women of the harem. It defined relationships, guided behavior, and reinforced hierarchy without overt conflict. It was not a drama to be witnessed by outsiders, but an immersive, pervasive presence that shaped the internal and external world of the Ottoman palace, quietly reminding each woman of her position, her ambitions, and the constant, measured negotiation of influence that marked life behind the high walls and latticed windows of Topkapı Palace. In the secluded, intricately ordered world of the Ottoman Harem, the most formidable presence was that of the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, whose authority extended above all other women, and whose influence permeated every corner of palace life. While the concubines, odalisques, and favorites navigated the subtle rhythms of hierarchy and the quiet competition of jealousy, the Valide Sultan occupied a position of unparalleled power, both formal and informal, combining maternal oversight with political authority. Her presence was a constant reminder that the harem, though secluded from the outside world, was a carefully governed environment, shaped by her judgment, supervision, and strategic awareness. The Valide Sultan's control was exercised in ways both visible and imperceptible. She was responsible for maintaining order among the women, ensuring the proper observance of routines, rituals, and hierarchies, and managing the flow of information between the harem and the sultan. Her decisions influenced the allocation of rooms, attendance, and privileges, determining which concubines might rise in favor, which might be disciplined, and which alliances were permitted or discouraged. Even small gestures, a nod, a glance, the slight lifting of a hand could convey approval or censure, signaling subtle shifts in power that the women of the harem were trained to recognize and respond to with the utmost attentiveness. The presence of the Valide Sultan was both commanding and measured. She moved through the harem's corridors and chambers with a quiet authority that required no loud assertion. Her steps, her gaze, and her interactions were deliberate and infused with centuries of accumulated tradition. To a novice, her entrance into a room could transform the atmosphere. The rhythm of conversations paused, embroidery needles were set aside, music practice slowed, and even the air seemed to adjust to accommodate her authority. Her awareness of the hierarchy ensured that every woman knew her place, and her mediation in disputes or tensions often settled questions that might otherwise have escalated into lasting conflicts. The Valide Sultan's role was not merely administrative, it was also deeply symbolic. She embodied the continuity of dynastic power, representing the stability of the Sultan's household and, by extension, the broader Ottoman state. Her judgment and comportment were instructive, serving as an example of comportment, piety, and political acumen for the women beneath her. Observing her, concubines learned the delicate balance between discretion and influence, obedience and subtle negotiation, understanding that ultimate power was exercised not through noise or confrontation, but through measured presence, strategic oversight, and the careful cultivation of respect. Beyond supervision, the Valide Sultan often acted as a mediator and patron within the palace. She guided the education and advancement of favored concubines, instructed novices in ritual and etiquette, and occasionally intervened in matters that intersected with the Sultan's preferences. Her judgment could elevate a woman from obscurity to prominence, or conversely, redirect attention away from those whose behavior was deemed inappropriate or insufficiently disciplined. In this way, she shaped the internal politics of the harem with a combination of maternal care, strategic acumen, and unyielding authority, ensuring that the palace remained a space of order rather than chaos. The influence of the Valide Sultan also extended to the Sultan himself. Mothers often cultivated relationships with their sons, providing counsel, advice, and sometimes subtle pressure that could influence decisions beyond the harem, affecting state affairs, succession or appointments within the palace hierarchy. While the concubines experienced her authority primarily in daily routines, supervision, and indirect management of favor, the Valide Sultan's position bridged private and public power, linking the domestic order of the harem to the broader governance of the empire. Her presence was further reinforced by ritual and ceremonial observances. The Valide Sultan's appearances were often coordinated with specific moments of prayer, the introduction of new concubines, or audiences with the Sultan, emphasizing the continuity and gravitas of her role. Every movement, every gesture, and every interaction was measured, contributing to an atmosphere of controlled reverence that permeated the palace. Even in leisure, when she might walk through the gardens, attend to embroidery, or listen to music, her conduct was imbued with authority, shaping the behavior and expectations of all who observed her. The psychological impact of her authority on the concubines was profound. Life in the harem required constant awareness of hierarchy, and the Valide Sultan's oversight served as both a stabilizing and regulating force. Women learned to anticipate her presence, adjust their conduct, and internalize the lessons of discretion, patience, and strategic interaction. The subtle cues of approval or disapproval, a glance, a pause, a word spoken in measured tone, informed behavior as powerfully as the structured rules and formal rituals that govern daily life. Even the quietest moments, such as prayer, bathing, or embroidery, were framed by her authority. Her oversight ensured that the rhythm of life within the harem remained disciplined, uninterrupted, and aligned with both spiritual and social expectations. In every measured breath, every careful gesture, and every calculated interaction, the influence of the Valide Sultan was present, reminding the concubines that power, while subtle, was inescapable and omnipresent. Thus, the Valide Sultan's authority was not merely a positional or ceremonial role, it was an immersive, omnipresent force that structured life within the harem. Through her watchful presence, measured guidance, and strategic oversight, she shaped both the daily routines and the long-term trajectories of the women under her care. Her power, exercised with calm precision, underscored the hierarchy, regulated behavior, and ensured that the palace remained a world of order, discipline, and quiet influence, where even the smallest gesture could carry profound significance in the ongoing rhythm of Ottoman court life. While the Ottoman harem is often imagined through the lens of aesthetic beauty, opulent surroundings, and the Sultan's favor, the lives of concubines encompassed far more than these superficial associations. Beyond the carefully orchestrated baths, the measured music lessons, and the subtle navigation of hierarchy, the women of the harem engaged in a slow, contemplative rhythm of learning, craft, and service that occupied much of their time. This dimension of harem life, often overshadowed by notions of luxury or intrigue, provided a framework in which concubines developed intellectual, artistic, and social skills, cultivating a form of influence and personal accomplishment that extended beyond the Sultan's immediate attention. Education was a cornerstone of daily life. Novices and odalisques underwent instruction in calligraphy, a practice that required patient, meticulous repetition, and offered a meditative focus. Every curve of a letter, every line of ink applied to delicate paper, demanded concentration and control, and the slow progression from basic shapes to intricate scripts mirrored the broader training in discipline and comportment that the harem instilled. Calligraphy was more than an artistic pursuit, it served as a subtle marker of refinement and competence, reflecting both cultural literacy and the patience required to succeed within the palace hierarchy. In addition to calligraphy, concubines studied music, both vocal and instrumental, through extended sessions designed to develop not only skill but composure and presence. The tuning of stringed instruments, the gentle repetition of melodies, and the soft flowing cadences of traditional songs created an immersive, calming environment. Music became a means of internalizing discipline, of marking the slow passage of time, and of cultivating a subtle personal grace that could enhance favor while also providing quiet personal solace. Each note practiced and each piece perfected contributed to a concubine's standing, both in terms of cultural accomplishment and perceived refinement. Medicine and herbal knowledge were also cultivated, particularly among concubines who showed aptitude or were encouraged by senior women. Training included the preparation of remedies, understanding the properties of herbs, and attending to minor ailments of the harem's residents. This knowledge, passed down through slow, patient instruction, allowed concubines to serve as caretakers within the palace, reinforcing their utility beyond beauty or charm, and embedding them within the functional infrastructure of harem life. Through these practices, women developed a quiet competence that extended the scope of their influence, enabling them to care for one another and to maintain the health and comfort of the broader household. Charity and correspondence were further dimensions of harem life that extended a concubine's world beyond the palace walls. Writing letters to family members, friends or distant relatives required careful attention to etiquette, linguistic skill, and subtle diplomacy, and these acts reinforced social ties while maintaining the harem's sense of connection to the wider Ottoman world. Charitable activity, coordinated by senior women or the Valide Sultan, offered another avenue of engagement, funding repairs to mosques, distributing alms or supporting education for girls in distant provinces. These acts, slow, deliberate, and often conducted in silence, allowed concubines to shape the world beyond the harem, even while confined within its walls, blending social responsibility with personal cultivation. Literature and poetry were central to the intellectual life of the harem as well. Women memorized verses from the Quran, engaged in the interpretation of classical texts, and composed their own poetry, often in secret to refine expression and sharpen mental acuity. These pursuits were immersive and slow-paced, requiring both patience and attention, and provided an additional layer of accomplishment that reinforced a concubine's refinement, education, and social standing. The act of writing or reciting poetry was quiet, reflective, and deeply personal, yet it was also socially significant, marking the woman as literate, cultured, and adept in the subtleties of courtly expression. Even leisure and contemplation were woven into this pattern of purposeful activity. Walks through the harem's gardens, observation of fountains, and attention to the changing seasons provided moments of reflection and calm. These interludes were measured, almost ceremonial in their pacing, allowing concubines to internalize lessons, practice mindfulness, and consider their own place within the broader social hierarchy. The combination of structured education, artistic practice, service, and reflection created a rhythm of life that was immersive, intellectually and emotionally engaging, and far removed from superficial notions of indulgence or pleasure alone. The cumulative effect of these activities was profound. While the Sultan's favor could alter the trajectory of a woman's status, it was the daily engagement with learning, art, medicine, and charitable work that grounded the concubines, providing them with skill, purpose, and a sense of personal agency within the constraints of palace life. Through slow, deliberate cultivation, they exercised influence both within the harem and beyond, embedding themselves in networks of knowledge, social care, and cultural refinement that transcended the immediate focus on appearance or charm. Thus, life beyond pleasure was a quiet, immersive reality of harem existence, shaped by education, creativity, service, and reflection. It was slow and methodical, demanding patience, discipline, and attention to detail, and it offered a dimension of autonomy and accomplishment that complemented the hierarchies, favors, and subtle competitions of palace life. Within these structured pursuits, concubines developed skills, cultivated intellect, and reinforced social and cultural influence, ensuring that their presence in the Ottoman harem resonated far beyond immediate appearances, leaving a lasting imprint on both their own lives and the functioning of the imperial household. Beyond the marble corridors, latticed windows, and intricately carved doors of the Topkapı Palace, the hidden gardens offered a rare respite for the women of the Ottoman Harem, a carefully controlled space where nature and architecture intertwined to create an environment at once private, serene, and imbued with symbolic meaning. These gardens, though confined within high walls, provided a quiet, immersive refuge from the rigor, discipline, and hierarchical pressures of palace life, allowing concubines, odalisques, and even the Valide Sultan to experience a slow, measured communion with the natural world. Yet, even in their apparent freedom, the gardens remained an extension of the harem's structure, orderly, supervised, and designed to harmonize with the palace's rhythms rather than disrupt them. The gardens themselves were layered with meaning and careful design. Pathways of stone and gravel meandered through beds of carefully tended flowers, herbs, and shrubs, their arrangement both aesthetic and deliberate. Fragrant blooms, selected for seasonal display and sensory effect, perfumed the air, their presence encouraging contemplation and gentle awareness of time's passage. Trees, often pruned into precise forms, provided shade and the soft rustle of leaves, their movement whispering in the quiet air. In some sections, caged birds added a musical counterpoint, their gentle songs echoing through the corridors of greenery, offering the women an impression of life and freedom that was carefully curated and contained. The fountains were among the most significant features, their slow, continuous movement providing both auditory and visual rhythm to the gardens. All water trickled, gurgled, and splashed into small basins, creating patterns of sound that marked the passage of time without the need for bells or clocks. For the concubines, these fountains were a source of meditative reflection. The slow, repetitive motion of water mirrored the quiet pacing of their lives, offering moments of solace and continuity in a world defined by hierarchy and ritual. The sound of flowing water became a companion to prayer, music practice, embroidery, and study, a subtle reminder of the natural cycles that continued beyond the walls of the palace. The gardens also served as an arena of measured social interaction. All women might walk slowly along the paths, accompanied by attendants or in pairs, speaking in hushed tones that were carefully modulated to avoid drawing attention from the eunuchs or senior figures. In these walks, the soft light of the sun filtered through trees and trellises, dappling the ground and creating shifting patterns of shadow and illumination. These moments allowed for quiet observation, reflection, and even whispered communication, a chance to navigate alliances, convey subtle messages, or simply breathe in a controlled environment that still carried a semblance of freedom. Even the arrangement of plants and structures within the gardens reflected the ordered, hierarchical nature of the harem. Seating areas, pergolas, and small pavilions were strategically positioned to allow supervision from eunuchs or senior women, while still offering concubines a sense of private space. Every pathway, fountain, and arbor was aligned with palace corridors and chambers, ensuring that movement through the gardens remained consistent with the broader architectural and social organization. The women experienced these spaces as simultaneously expansive and confined. The sensation of wandering beneath trees or along shaded paths contrasted with the knowledge that walls, gates, and watchful eyes constrained their freedom. The sensory experience of the gardens was slow and immersive, deliberately constructed to cultivate calm, contemplation, and internalization. The soft rustling of leaves, the scent of herbs and flowers, the gentle hum of insects, and the trickling water of fountains all combined to create an atmosphere that was simultaneously soothing and structured. This sensory rhythm mirrored the broader temporal flow of harem life, mornings and evenings marked by prayer, lessons, music, and embroidery, days punctuated by quiet observation, disciplined reflection, and the occasional movement through the ordered natural space of the gardens. Even in moments of personal reflection, the gardens reinforced the underlying structure of life in the harem. The slow, measured pacing of walks encouraged observation, patience, and composure, qualities essential to surviving and thriving within the palace hierarchy. The beauty of the environment, while providing comfort, also reminded the concubines of the broader system of control. Every plant, fountain, and birdcage was placed with intention, symbolizing the boundaries, order, and subtle orchestration of daily life. In this sense, the gardens were both an escape and a lesson, a microcosm of palace life in which the appearance of natural freedom was harmonized with the enduring demands of discipline and hierarchy. Caged birds in particular served as a quiet metaphor for the concubines themselves. Their song filled the air with life, their flight limited to the span of their enclosure, echoing the measured freedom experienced by women within the palace walls. The gentle presence of these creatures, combined with the structured beauty of the gardens, offered moments of reflection on patience, adaptation, and the slow unfolding of life under scrutiny. In their observation of nature, women internalized lessons about rhythm, endurance, and the balance between constraint and expression. Thus, the hidden gardens of Topkapı Palace were more than decorative spaces. They were immersive environments that shaped the internal and external lives of the harem's women. Through careful design, sensory detail, and deliberate pacing, the gardens offered solace, reflection, and quiet social engagement, while simultaneously reinforcing the disciplined hierarchical structure of palace life. Within these secluded paths and shaded alcoves, the concubines experienced a form of beauty that was at once calming, instructive, and intimately tied to the subtle architecture of power, reminding them that even in moments of seeming freedom, life within the harem was measured, observed, and profoundly interconnected. Within the seemingly secluded walls of the Ottoman Harem, where the daily life of concubines was governed by ritual, routine, and hierarchy, there existed a subtler, almost imperceptible layer of influence, the slow and measured currents of politics. Though the harem was physically separated from the administrative centers of the empire, it was never truly isolated from power. Information flowed quietly through its corridors, carried in the hushed tones of eunuchs, the discreet notes of attendants, and the deliberate gestures of women attuned to the nuances of hierarchy. In this slow-moving, shadowed environment, whispers became instruments of influence, shaping perceptions, decisions, and in some cases, the course of state affairs. The harem's influence on politics was neither dramatic nor overt. It operated through observation, conversation, and subtle intercession. Concubines who had achieved favor, and particularly those under the guidance of the Valide Sultan, could introduce matters of concern, highlight personalities, or signal preferences to the Sultan in ways that were carefully framed, measured, and discreet. These interventions rarely involved explicit demands, rather they relied on suggestion, nuanced communication, and the cultivation of attention over time. A story repeated with care, a gesture of emphasis, or a question posed at the right moment could ripple outward, affecting appointments, policies, or personal decisions within the palace and beyond. Rumors and reports were central to this quiet political mechanism. Couriers within the harem carried news from the outer world, events in the provinces, concerns of administrators, or the subtle behaviors of influential figures, which were then filtered through the layers of hierarchy before reaching the Sultan or his mother. Eunuchs played a critical role in this process, acting as intermediaries whose silence and discretion ensured that information traveled only along sanctioned channels. Women learned to interpret these slow currents of knowledge, distinguishing between idle gossip and the signals that mattered, understanding that timing, tone, and subtle emphasis could carry far more weight than outright declarations. The concubines themselves became adept at internal diplomacy. Relationships within the harem, forged through alliances, trust, and shared tasks, created networks through which information moved, shaped, and occasionally amplified. A favored concubine might observe the reactions of her peers, noting expressions of approval, envy, or hesitation, and use these observations to adjust her own behavior or subtly influence outcomes. Even minor interactions, the choice of words in a whispered conversation, the positioning during a shared task, the quiet exchange of glances, could serve as tools in the slow negotiation of influence. The Valide Sultan's presence intensified these dynamics. Her authority provided the framework through which information could be filtered, prioritized, and conveyed to the Sultan in a manner consistent with palace etiquette and strategic calculation. Women under her guidance could gain access to the Sultan indirectly, their perspectives presented through layers of careful mediation. In this way, the harem functioned not only as a domestic and social space, but also as a subtle extension of governance, its rhythms, rituals, and interpersonal dynamics, influencing decisions far beyond the marble walls and garden paths of Topkapı Palace. Even routine activities carried political weight when observed in context. Music practice, calligraphy lessons, or garden walks were often opportunities to demonstrate composure, intellect, and judgment. A concubine's ability to listen, respond thoughtfully, or navigate hierarchical expectations reflected not only personal refinement, but also a readiness to engage with matters of significance. Small decisions, which room to occupy, whom to accompany in the gardens, or how to address a senior attendant, were interpreted as markers of character and reliability, influencing perceptions that could travel, slowly and deliberately, to the ears of those with authority. The slow pace of these political currents mirrored the overall rhythm of harem life. Nothing was immediate. Influence accumulated over months and years, conveyed through repetition, subtlety, and careful calibration. The women who mastered this environment understood that discretion, patience, and observation were far more powerful than overt assertion. Even the smallest whispers, when timed and framed correctly, could alter the trajectory of a relationship, a favor, or a decision within the palace hierarchy. The harem's political dimension also extended outward, connecting the private world of the women with the wider empire. Reports of provincial unrest, the movements of diplomats, or the conditions of distant subjects were occasionally filtered through the palace hierarchy to the sultan. Concubines who were literate, trained in correspondence, or adept at interpreting subtle signals contributed to the transmission of information in ways that, while hidden, were consequential. Their engagement in these processes reinforced the slow, immersive nature of harem life. Every conversation, gesture, and observation was potentially significant, even if its importance would only be revealed over long periods. Thus, within the controlled, measured confines of the harem, whispers of politics flowed continuously, threading through corridors, gardens, and chambers in a quiet, persistent current. They influenced perception, shaped decisions, and occasionally altered the course of events in ways invisible to outsiders. Life within the palace was not merely a cycle of ritual, routine, and hierarchy. It was also an ongoing engagement with subtle power, a slow negotiation of influence, and a continuous calibration of observation, discretion, and strategic communication. In this silent, immersive environment, the act of listening, reflecting, and positioning oneself carefully became a form of authority, as meaningful and enduring as any formal edict issued from the sultan's chambers. In the carefully measured rhythms of the Ottoman harem, the bearing of a child represented a profound and irreversible transformation, one that could redefine the trajectory of a concubine's life in ways both subtle and monumental. Among the women who navigated the hierarchy of the palace, motherhood, particularly the birth of a son, was recognized as a pivot point, a slow and deliberate shift that conferred status, influence, and a degree of security otherwise inaccessible. This transformation, however, was neither immediate nor simplistic. It unfolded over months and years, intertwined with rituals, hierarchy, and the quiet negotiation of attention and authority within the palace. The anticipation of motherhood began long before conception. Women who had gained favor with the sultan experienced the deliberate pacing of courtship and intimacy, structured not as spontaneous encounters, but as carefully observed and orchestrated moments. Eunuchs, servants, and senior women oversaw the interactions, ensuring both propriety and the optimal conditions for the continuation of the dynasty. For the concubine, each gesture, preparation, and ritual act carried significance, imbuing the process with an unspoken awareness that her life could be irrevocably altered. Even the passage of time, marked by lessons, baths, and embroidery, was punctuated by the slow consideration of potential destiny, the quiet hope of maternity, and the subtle observation of signs that might indicate favor or possibility. Once pregnancy was confirmed, the concubine's daily life shifted in rhythm and focus. Physical care, rest, and nourishment became central, yet her role within the harem remained governed by the same structures of hierarchy and supervision. The women who had long observed and competed with her now regarded her differently, elevated in significance, their awareness tinged with deference, envy, or cautious respect. Her body became both private sanctuary and symbol of continuity, an emblem of the sultan's lineage, and by extension of the palace's enduring authority. These months were marked by a measured stillness, punctuated by ritualized care, gentle walks in the hidden gardens, and attentive observation of changes in favor or status among peers. The process of childbirth, in turn, was both intensely private and profoundly ceremonial. Within carefully arranged chambers, attended by experienced midwives and overseen by senior women, the concubine gave birth under the close watch of those charged with both her safety and the protection of her child. Silence, discipline, and ritual framed the event. No sudden movement, no loud exclamations, only the slow, deliberate orchestration of care. The arrival of a child, especially a male heir, transformed the concubine's identity. She was no longer merely a favored woman within the harem, but a mother whose presence carried political, social, and dynastic weight. Motherhood brought a slow but enduring elevation in influence. The sultan's attention, while never permanent, now had a lasting connection through the child. Senior women, including the Valide Sultan, extended guidance, protection, and acknowledgement, ensuring that the new mother's position was recognized within the hierarchy. Her words carried greater weight in daily routines. Her observations and suggestions were listened to with heightened attention. Even in moments of quiet reflection, she understood that her presence was now intertwined with the dynastic structure of the empire, and that her influence could shape interactions, decisions, and allegiances within the palace. The child itself became a source of both personal security and political significance. Sons as potential heirs brought a measure of protection and respect that shielded the mother from some of the pressures and vulnerabilities inherent in harem life. The slow, careful education and observation of the child's growth and comportment were inseparable from the mother's ongoing responsibilities, ensuring that her attention, guidance, and influence remained continuously exercised. Daughters, while often less politically consequential in direct succession terms, could nonetheless be raised with consideration for strategic marriages or placement within the broader web of Ottoman alliances, offering the mother an indirect channel of influence within the empire. The social dynamics of the harem shifted accordingly. Rivalry and jealousy among peers persisted, but the mother of a child, especially a son, gained a layer of authority difficult to contest. Her position was now reinforced by both familial connection and institutional recognition, altering the subtle currents of observation, deference, and alliance that shaped palace life. Even routine activities, garden walks, music lessons, embroidery sessions were suffused with the quiet acknowledgement of her new status. The harem, while still a space of discipline and observation, now oriented in small but significant ways around her presence, her movements, and her responsibilities as a mother. Yet this elevation was not without complexity. The concubine's fortunes remained linked to the survival and well-being of her child, and the slow accumulation of influence could be tempered by changing political circumstances, rivalries, or the sultan's shifting attention. Motherhood demanded vigilance, patience, and continual navigation of palace politics, ensuring that both mother and child were protected and positioned advantageously within the broader dynastic structure. It was a delicate balance. The security afforded by maternal status required constant awareness, careful interaction, and the disciplined management of relationships within the harem. In this way, the fate of mothers within the Ottoman harem was defined by a slow, immersive transformation. The birth of a child, particularly a son, marked the passage from relative uncertainty to enduring influence, shaping the concubine's life across emotional, social, and political dimensions. Every step of this process, anticipation, pregnancy, childbirth, and subsequent care, unfolded in a measured rhythm, suffused with ritual, observation, and subtle negotiation. In the quiet interstices of palace life, the mother became a living symbol of continuity, her presence anchoring both the dynastic future and the intricate hierarchies of the harem, and her life thereafter defined by the interplay of nurture, influence, and enduring, meticulously managed authority. In the vast and meticulously ordered world of the Ottoman harem, favor was never permanent, and the precarious balance of status could shift slowly or suddenly, reshaping the lives of women who once held prominence. For those whose influence waned, whether through the loss of the sultan's attention, political miscalculations, or the natural passage of time, the consequence was often a measured, gradual transition into a life of diminished visibility, a slow fading that might culminate in relocation to the old palace, or a quiet existence in relative obscurity. Even in these circumstances, the rhythm of palace life and the discipline of hierarchical awareness continued to frame experience, shaping behavior and perception with the subtle force of routine, expectation, and memory. Exile to the old palace, known in Ottoman Turkish as the Eski Sare, was perhaps the most formalized outcome for women whose favor had declined. This transfer was not abrupt but orchestrated with deliberate care. Arrangements for attendance, personal belongings, and living quarters were prepared over time, maintaining dignity even as influence receded. The old palace itself, while lacking the immediate proximity to the Sultan, remained a space of refinement, steeped in history, ritual, and the residual prestige of past prominence. Women who entered its walls experienced a gradual adjustment, learning to navigate a quieter, more private world where hierarchical pressures were reduced but not entirely absent. Life in the old palace was defined by a slow rhythm that mirrored the larger patterns of the harem, but in a diminished and more introspective form. Daily routines continued: prayer, study, embroidery, occasional garden walks, yet the urgency and intensity of courtly competition were replaced with measured reflection. Women who had once been central to palace politics and personal influence now found themselves observers of a world they once helped shape, their knowledge and experience informing a quiet authority exercised over personal space and the attendants who remained in their service. Time in exile became a period of endurance, an extended exercise in patience, adaptation, and the cultivation of composure. For some, fading from favor did not necessitate physical relocation. Within the main palace itself, diminished attention from the Sultan or the Valide Sultan resulted in a subtle but pervasive shift in daily life. Opportunities for engagement, the gentle walks in the gardens, the lessons in music and calligraphy, the ceremonial moments of visibility, became rare or carefully limited. Conversations, once filled with influence and subtle negotiation, were reduced to observation and quiet participation. The slow erosion of prominence created an internal landscape in which endurance became the central strategy, observing without interference, participating without prominence, and maintaining dignity through the continued adherence to ritual, decorum, and self-discipline. Retirement in obscurity, whether in the old palace or within a quieter corner of Topkapı itself, carried both emotional and practical dimensions. The women who endured this transition relied on the habits and skills cultivated over years of immersive training, literacy, artistic accomplishment, religious observance, and social acumen provided means of purposeful engagement, even in reduced circumstances. They might write letters, oversee the education of younger women, maintain gardens or practice music and embroidery, filling the slow hours with structured absorbing tasks that lent continuity and quiet meaning to daily life. Even in diminished circumstances, the capacity for reflection, subtle influence, and careful observation allowed women to retain a form of authority within the constraints of their changed position. The psychological impact of exile or fading favor was complex. For many women, the process involved reconciling past prominence with present limitations, internalizing the lessons of hierarchy, patience, and discretion that had long governed life in the harem. Memory, ritual, and observation became tools for maintaining equilibrium, recalling previous influence, observing the ongoing dynamics of the palace from a removed position, and adjusting behavior to align with new realities. The slow, deliberate pacing of daily life facilitated a form of meditation on impermanence, power, and adaptation, reinforcing both humility and resilience. Even in obscurity, the legacy of a concubine's presence could endure. Her knowledge, artistic skill, and social networks often continued to shape the education, refinement, and subtle maneuverings of younger women within the palace. The transfer of experience through observation, mentorship, or quiet example ensured that influence, while no longer direct, persisted in layered and indirect ways. Time itself became a medium through which authority, wisdom, and legacy were transmitted, measured not in immediate favor, but in accumulated experience and the silent shaping of palace culture over years and decades. The slow transitions from prominence to exile or quiet retirement were framed by ceremonial and architectural considerations as well. Moves between chambers, adjustments to attendants, and the allocation of resources were carefully managed to preserve decorum and minimize disruption, ensuring that even loss of favor was experienced within the measured rhythms of palace life. The careful orchestration of these transitions reinforced the harem's enduring structure. Every action, even in diminution, was enveloped in ritual, hierarchy, and deliberate pacing. Ultimately, the fate of women who lost favor reflected the broader truths of harem existence. Life was both intensely ordered and subject to impermanence. Hierarchy was inescapable, and influence was always mediated by time, observation, and careful navigation of circumstance. Exile, quiet retirement, or fading prominence required endurance, patience, and the continued application of the skills honed over years of disciplined life. In these slow, immersive transitions, the women of the Ottoman harem learned to carry their identity, knowledge, and dignity forward, shaping their existence in ways that were subtle, enduring, and intimately tied to the rhythm and architecture of palace life. Within the walls of the Ottoman harem, time moved with a peculiar rhythm, one that was simultaneously measured, immersive, and almost imperceptible to the women who inhabited it. Days followed days with a quiet predictability, marked by the same sequence of rituals, lessons, prayers and observations that had been ingrained through years of careful training. Yet, within this repetition, the passage of years became visible in subtle, slow ways in the softening of features, the gradual graying of hair, the faint deepening of lines on hands and faces, and the internal accumulation of memories that layered one upon another, quietly shaping identity and experience. For the concubines, life was both immediate and reflective, a continuum in which the present was constantly interlaced with recollection and anticipation. The arrival of new girls into the harem was a regular, almost ceremonial event, and it punctuated the otherwise steady flow of life with fresh movement and subtle disruption. Novices appeared at the gates, escorted by eunuchs, their expressions a mixture of fear, curiosity and disciplined restraint. The older concubines observed them carefully, noting their posture, their composure, and the quality of their education, both to assess potential rivalry and to reflect on the passing of their own youth. These arrivals reminded the women of the inexorable flow of time. The young bright-eyed faces contrasted with their own more experienced, measured demeanors, and the cycle of succession, favor and hierarchy was made vividly, slowly apparent. Daily routines continued in their familiar deliberate pattern. Morning prayers echoed through the chambers, followed by quiet lessons in calligraphy, music or poetry, the soft scratch of pen on paper, or the gentle pluck of strings marking the measured passing of hours. Meals were taken in hushed companionship, baths observed ritualistically, and walks in the hidden gardens traced the same paths that had been walked for decades. Each repetition reinforced the internal sense of continuity, but also highlighted change, the subtle shifts in attitude, the new patterns of favor, the gradual accumulation of authority, or conversely, decline in influence. Time left its imprint in every careful gesture, every quietly executed task, and every patient observation of peers. Memory became a constant companion in the passage of years. Women recalled the arrivals and departures of concubines who had preceded them, the fleeting moments of the sultan's attention, the small triumphs and setbacks of daily life, and the broader world outside the palace walls, glimpsed in letters, news from eunuchs, or the occasional account of distant provinces. The outside world remained ever present in memory and imagination, streets filled with merchants and horses, the call of distant mosques, the seasonal changes of Istanbul, and the movements of empire. These recollections were often tinged with longing or quiet contemplation, forming an internal landscape that expanded the boundaries of the palace, even as walls, gates and hierarchy contained physical movement. Aging within the harem was gradual but undeniable. Bodies became less supple, steps slower, and stamina diminished. Yet the rituals, training and routines continued with the same careful precision. Women adapted their participation accordingly, observing more than actively leading, advising younger concubines, or practicing skills quietly in their chambers. The physical changes were accompanied by an accumulation of knowledge, insight, and subtle authority, a slow accrual that gave enduring influence even as youthful beauty faded. The passage of time in this sense was both a challenge and a source of layered power, reinforcing the depth of experience over mere presence or appearance. The cyclical nature of palace life created an almost hypnotic awareness of time. Seasonal festivals, religious observances, and the measured arrival of letters, gifts or news from the outside world punctuated the years with deliberate markers. Our music practice, embroidery, garden walks and prayer provided a framework through which time could be both lived and observed, offering continuity in an environment defined by hierarchy and ritual. The rhythm of life, repeated and reflected upon, became an anchor, allowing concubines to situate themselves within the slow unfolding of decades and the ever-shifting patterns of favor and hierarchy. The observation of new arrivals also reinforced a sense of lineage, responsibility, and continuity. Older women, often mothers or mentors, guided the novices, teaching the same lessons in etiquette, music, calligraphy, and piety that they themselves had learned. In doing so, they became both guardians and witnesses to the ongoing cycle of palace life, a slow but tangible connection between generations that maintained the coherence of the harem as a social and cultural institution. The passage of time was thus experienced collectively as well as individually. the slow accumulation of years mirrored in relationships, mentorship, and the rhythm of daily activities. Even small, seemingly insignificant details could register the passage of time. The changing patterns of gardens, the subtle alterations in decor, the wear on corridors and furniture, the gradual evolution of fashion and ritual, all provided cues that life, while rhythmically constant, was nonetheless moving inexorably forward. Within this measured environment, concubines learned patience, observation and reflection, finding both solace and purpose in the quiet accumulation of experience and the careful marking of the slow, imperceptible passing of years. Thus, life within the harem unfolded as a continuous interplay of repetition, observation and reflection. Time passed not in dramatic leaps but in subtle gradations, in the arrival of new girls, the slow aging of bodies, the accumulation of wisdom, and the quiet remembrance of a world outside the palace walls. Each day was immersed in routine, yet each day also carried the imprint of change, memory and enduring presence, creating a slow, immersive and profoundly contemplative sense of life, measured not only by hours and rituals, but by the gentle, almost imperceptible flow of decades. Even within the meticulously ordered, slow-paced world of the Ottoman harem, the lives of concubines were invariably shaped by the lingering presence of those women whose influence had transcended the boundaries of the palace chambers, extending into the political, social, and cultural fabric of the empire itself. These women, Hürrem Sultan, Kösem Sultan, and a few others whose names have endured through the centuries, served as enduring examples of what could be achieved from within the confines of the harem, their stories echoing across time and through the consciousness of every woman who entered those walls. The presence of such figures, whether in memory, tale, or whispered legend, imposed a slow, pervasive awareness of the possibilities and perils inherent in palace life, influencing behavior, ambition, and expectation in ways both subtle and profound. Hürrem Sultan, known as Roxolana in some accounts, represented a radical shift in the life of concubines, transforming her position as a favored woman of Sultan Süleyman Nar into one of unprecedented political, social, and cultural authority. Her story was retold with careful detail among the women of the harem, not in the form of excitement or gossip, but as a measured narrative, illustrating the potential consequences of strategic intelligence, emotional restraint, and patient negotiation within the palace hierarchy. Her ascent, marked by patience, attention to detail, and an unerring awareness of the Sultan's disposition, became a reference point, a cautionary yet aspirational tale, reminding concubines that influence was attainable, but demanded discipline, observation, and timing. Kösem Sultan, another prominent figure, embodied a longer, more sustained form of power. Rising to prominence in the early 17th century, she became not only a favored consort, but also the mother of sultans and, for a time, the effective regent of the empire. Her presence within the harem, and her enduring influence over state matters, created a shadow that persisted across decades, a structural example of how maternal status, intellect and strategic acumen could transform the trajectory of a concubine's life. Her story, like Hürrem Sultan's, circulated quietly through corridors, gardens and chambers, serving both as inspiration and as a subtle reminder of the stakes, the discipline required, and the ever-present hierarchy that structured opportunity and limitation alike. For the ordinary concubine, the echoes of such power were experienced in layered ways. On one hand, these stories provided a mental map of ambition, the possibility of rising beyond the routine, of cultivating attention and influence, and of shaping events within and even beyond the walls of Topkapı Palace. On the other hand, they also cast a shadow of caution. The experiences of these powerful women, while extraordinary, were often fraught with rivalry, intrigue and risk. Every gain in status carried the potential for loss. Every moment of influence demanded vigilance, and the passage of time could transform triumph into obscurity. Observing these legacies, women of the harem internalized lessons of patience, discretion, and strategic thought, understanding that influence was slow to accrue, carefully measured, and contingent upon countless subtle factors. The shadow of these figures also permeated the hierarchy itself. Novices, odalisque, and concubines alike were aware that their behavior, composure, and attentiveness were being observed in reference to the historical standards set by those who had attained enduring power. Actions, whether minor gestures in the gardens, the rhythm of prayer, or the composition of embroidery and music, were imbued with meaning in relation to these exemplary lives. Even silence, measured observation, and the quiet cultivation of alliances became mechanisms through which influence might be accrued, mirroring the subtle strategies employed by Hürrem, Kösem, and others. In the daily life of the harem, the echoes of power manifested in practical ways. Mentorship, observation, and reflection were all informed by the examples set by these extraordinary women. Older concubines would quietly guide novices, illustrating how patience, tact, and careful attention to detail could translate into favor and authority. Lessons in etiquette, decorum, and composure were framed not merely as rituals, but as tools for navigating a complex social and political landscape, echoing the paths charted by those who had risen to prominence before them. Even in seemingly mundane moments, the timing of a smile, the placement of a flower in the garden, the modulation of a conversation, the legacies of these women served as a subtle guiding framework, shaping thought and behavior with the weight. The enduring impact of these powerful figures also shaped memory and imagination within the harem. Stories of their lives were retold in a slow, reflective cadence, emphasizing the deliberate pacing of their strategies, the patience of their observation, and the careful orchestration of relationships that allowed them to accumulate influence. These narratives, absorbed gradually over months and years, reinforced the immersive, contemplative rhythm of life within the palace. They were not tales of excitement or dramatic heroism, but slow, methodical lessons in perception, endurance, and the nuanced exercise of power. Even the youngest and newest members of the harem sensed the weight of these legacies. In their quiet training, during lessons in music, calligraphy, or religious instruction, the stories of Hürrem and Kösem provided a backdrop, an ambient understanding that life within the harem, though repetitive and regulated, was also a space where intelligence, patience, and subtle action could shape destiny. The passage of time, the hierarchy of favor, and the observance of protocol all interacted with these examples, creating a slow, immersive education in strategy, awareness, and the long arc of influence. Thus, the echoes of power reverberated through the walls, corridors, and gardens of the harem. They informed the way concubines moved, observed, and thought. They shaped expectations and guided behavior. They were both inspiration and caution, a measured reminder that while the palace constrained, disciplined, and observed, it also offered avenues, carefully navigated, for enduring influence. The lives of Hürrem Sultan, Kösem Sultan, and other extraordinary women became silent companions to every concubine, their presence felt in the rhythm of daily activity, the measured flow of conversation, and the quiet, persistent awareness of what could be achieved through patience, discretion, and strategic understanding. As the years stretched and folded upon themselves within the walls of Topkapı Palace, the life of a concubine emerged as a quiet, almost imperceptible continuum, defined by ritual, repetition, and the slow accumulation of experience. It was a life of waiting and observation, punctuated by fleeting moments of attention, recognition, or influence, yet primarily sustained by the rhythm of daily routines and the enduring presence of hierarchy. In the measured stillness of chambers, gardens, and corridors, the women of the harem learned to inhabit time in its slowest, most reflective form, observing, reflecting, and adjusting to the subtle shifts of fortune, favor, and circumstance that characterized palace life. From the moment of arrival, whether through tribute, selection, or circumstance, each concubine entered a world removed from the familiarities of the outside, the clatter of streets, the cries of vendors, the movement of markets. In exchange, she became immersed in a world governed by discipline, ritual, and careful observation. The gates she passed, the courtyards she traversed, and the chambers she inhabited were all imbued with layered significance, each space a marker of rank, authority, and the slow unfolding of influence. Even the act of learning, calligraphy, music, religion, and etiquette, was suffused with purpose beyond skill alone, teaching patience, precision, and the art of observing both the seen and unseen. The rhythm of daily life, with its structured repetition of baths, lessons, prayers, meals and quiet walks, created a framework in which both time and self were measured with care. The passage of years was marked not in dramatic leaps but in gradual transformations, the soft fading of youth, the accumulation of knowledge, the quiet adjustments of relationships and alliances within the harem. Moments of the sultan's favor, while brief and carefully mediated, could alter trajectories, bringing elevation, attention, and a subtle expansion of influence, yet they remained embedded within the broader, slower cadence of life that emphasized endurance, composure, hierarchy, discipline, and ritual shaped every aspect of existence. From the selection of rooms to the care of gardens, from musical practice to embroidery, from prayer to quiet observation of newcomers, even rivalry, jealousy and ambition were expressed in measured ways, filtered through the lenses of custom, etiquette, and long-standing social codes. Influence could be accrued, but always slowly, delicately, and strategically. It was a currency of patience, observation, and subtlety, rarely earned by overt action alone. In this environment, the women of the harem learned to navigate relationships, cultivate presence, and exercise judgment, all while maintaining the disciplined rhythms imposed by the palace's structures. Motherhood, when it arrived, transformed the experience in profound ways. The birth of a child, particularly a son, brought enduring significance, linking the concubine to the dynastic future, and conferring a measured form of authority that could endure for decades. Yet even this elevation was framed by caution, responsibility, and continued observation, for influence within the harem, however substantial, remained mediated by hierarchy, ritual, and the passage of time. The slow accumulation of status through maternal connection demonstrated the complex interplay of personal experience and systemic structure, illustrating how individual lives were both shaped by and contributors to the broader rhythms of palace life. The slow currents of political influence, transmitted through whispers, observation, and carefully mediated intervention, further illustrated the intricate dimensions of harem existence. Even in the absence of overt authority, concubines could participate in subtle negotiations, shape perceptions, and contribute to the transmission of information and influence. The stories of women like Hürrem Sultan and Kösem Sultan resonated through the chambers and corridors, providing both inspiration and caution, illustrating the possibilities of power and the careful navigation required to sustain it. Their legacies informed behavior, observation, and strategy, shaping the mental and social landscapes of all who followed. For those whose favor faded, exile or quiet retirement demonstrated the enduring importance of patience, dignity, and adaptability. Time, memory, and structured routines provided a framework for continuity, allowing women to inhabit their diminished circumstances with composure and grace. The slow accumulation of knowledge, observation, and experience became a form of enduring influence, as older concubines guided novices, maintained traditions, and shaped the subtler dynamics of palace life. Even fading prominence, when approached with reflection and care, remained meaningful within the immersive rhythm of the harem. Ultimately, the life of a concubine in the Ottoman harem was a blend of stillness and observation, of fleeting recognition and enduring ritual, of hierarchy, discipline, and the occasional exercise of subtle influence. It was a life lived almost entirely within walls, gardens, and chambers, yet it was also a life deeply engaged with the rhythms of time, the flow of relationships, and the accumulation of experience. Moments of attention, favor, or authority were precious, but the continuity of practice, patience, and reflection defined the daily existence, creating a slow, immersive understanding of both self and environment. In this quiet, measured existence, each day passed into the next, and each year layered upon the previous, creating a tapestry of life defined by endurance, observation, and subtle influence. The concubines moved through rituals, gardens, and chambers with grace, navigating relationships and hierarchy with careful attention. Their stories, though often unrecorded or hidden from history, echo across time, reminding us of the complex, contemplative, and deeply human experience of living within the secluded, meticulously ordered, and immersive world of the Ottoman harem. Here, silence was not merely absence, but a presence in itself. Waiting was not emptiness, but a form of engagement, and the passage of endless time within walls became, in its slow and measured unfolding, both a challenge and a form of quiet mastery over circumstance.